Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1962 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Anne Bancroft won for her performance in The Miracle Worker. But why did she beat fellow nominees Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, Geraldine Page, and Lee Remick? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 35th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1962. We'll be discussing why Anne Bancroft won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is, I would say, a mainstay on this show at this point. He's been heard a number of times on the Best Picture series, bonus episodes, one of the most insightful people in the awards sphere, I would say. He can be heard and read at Next Best Picture. He can be heard at Awards Watch, member of the Chicago Indie Critics Group. Welcome back, Josh Parham.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I cannot wait to have this very interesting discussion.
Yes. Truly so much to unpack here. And I'm just wanted to say up front that I feel like you have become the sort of person that I go to when I want some analysis on the Best Actress race and who's going to win. Really, ever since you pegged the Olivia Colman upset, that was really sort of like what did it for me and a lot of people. So I'm excited to have you here talking about a very iconic Best Actress race.
Yeah, it certainly seems like I have some insight to the Best Actress category that I think is maybe a little inflated at times, but I try my best.
Sometimes you only need just the one thing that you correctly call, and that's just your thing from then on.
I mean, I will be dining out on correctly predicting Coleman for a very, very long time.
And that is fair, and more power to you. All right, well, before we talk 1962, let's actually talk about this Best Actress category. So my first question for you, Josh, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
Well, when thinking about this, I kind of feel like there is an answer that I go to that's kind of boring, I feel like, because for me, it was always going to be Katharine Hepburn for The Line in Winter. That is like one of my favorite all-time performances. But, you know, I feel like that is said a lot for a lot of people. So to be a little bit different and to give some variety, I'm actually going to say one that I really love is Julia Roberts in Erin Brockovich.
Nice.
Really, really love that performance. And I feel like it kind of was a little dismissed at the beginning, but I feel like that is just a classic movie star performance that is just so magnetic and captivating, and it's funny, it's sad, and I feel like we don't really see that kind of a performance win anymore. And I get it that is an incredible Best Actress lineup to begin with. Like, it's really stacked the competition, you know, but I feel like that one has really endured in a way that I was very surprised at. And all these years later, I'm still thinking about it, and I think it's an all-timer performance.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a race and a win that has had ups and downs, I think, with how people feel about it, because at the time, there was just like no question. Julia Roberts, she swept every single award heading into the Oscars. It was like signed, sealed, delivered for her. And I feel like over time, it's sort of been like, oh my God, how did Ellen Burstyn not win for that? How did like Laura Linney? We would have loved to have seen her win for that. And now I feel like it's sort of looped back around a little bit to be like, oh yeah, Julia Roberts, like that was the best time and the best role for her to win, which is, to your point, I would say kind of rare that we get that. Someone winning for what I would say is maybe unquestionably her best performance.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I also really love that win. So, very good. And of course, on the flip side, my other question for you is, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
Yeah, I mean, this is another one where I feel like the objective answer has to be Judy Garland for A Star Is Born, but like how many people have said that? It's like
numerous on this show already. So yeah.
exactly, because it does feel like the most definitive answer. So
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of variety, again, I'm going to say something that I think will make you very happy. And I'm
Oh,
going to say Glenn Close for Dangerous Liaisons.
yes. Very good.
And mainly because of not just that it's clearly the best performance in that category, but it's
Mm-hmm.
the dominoes that you could see in the future. You know, if we had done this, Jodie Foster still would have gotten taken care of for Silence of the Lambs. And I think that's the element that makes it even more heartbreaking. It's just not only is it the best performance that lost, but given the nature of history, we would have been fine in the long run. And so many problems would have been avoided in the future.
Yeah, that is a real butterfly effect situation there if Glenn does win. I've certainly gone over that in my mind many times.
I'm sure you
Sleepless
have.
nights. Yes. I don't know what your opinion was on Frances McDormand in Three Billboards, but I feel like it's a similar maybe situation there where we had people like Saoirse Ronan and even, Sally Hawkins, Margot Robbie, all contending when Frances won, and then she would win a few years later for Nomadland. And I wonder if people might look back on that race in a similar way if none of those people ever win.
I do a little bit think about that. The one thing that, well, there's two things that's a little bit different for me is that one, I do still really like Frances McDormand in
Yeah.
Three Billboards. I don't mind that she has an Oscar for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just comparatively the performance is a little bit stronger to
I
justify
would
it.
agree.
And
Yeah.
also, I am now very invested in McDormand winning all the Best Actress Oscars that she can. Like I want her to break Katharine Hepburn's record, so I'm
Ooh,
sort of invested in that now, and that's another reason why I don't mind that she's on that trajectory at the moment.
that's interesting. And once again, we must wonder what is her on Golden Pond?
Yep.
Because I'm sure that's coming down the line.
Oh, absolutely. I fully believe that there is another Best Actress Oscar in her future.
Yes. Well, I think it's time to jump right into this one, where we will be actually talking about Katharine Hepburn. Let us just jump right into it. The 35th Academy Awards. The nominees were Anne Bancroft in The Miracle Worker, Bette Davis in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Katharine Hepburn in Long Day's Journey into Night, Geraldine Page in Sweet Bird of Youth, and Lee Remick in Days of Wine and Roses, with the winner being Anne Bancroft. So before we break down these individually, did you have overall thoughts before we really get into these individually about this lineup?
Well, I found it very interesting that looking at this lineup, just sort of in the context of history, as a lot of people know of this race because it's a very famous Best Actress race. You tend to hear about two performances a lot, and even some performances that weren't nominated that have also made the story. But
Yeah.
the other ones don't really get talked about that often. And having for the first time this past week just sat down and watched all of these performances one after another, I find it interesting that despite all of the gossip pushing people to talk about only a certain amount of these performances, it kind of feels a little justified. I mean, not to give a spoiler alert for later, but it does really feel like this is a very top-heavy Best Actress race. And there was a reason why we only really talk about, I think, a certain amount of them here, and the other ones are fine, but I think there is a very big gulf between, like, the top two and then 3 through 5 in this category for me.
Interesting. Well, I personally will just say that I've been looking forward to covering this year since I first made the decision to start covering Best Actress for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
I do think just the weight of all these performances, like all together in one lineup, is kind of overwhelming, honestly. And it is one of those, I think, great lineups that I love, which represent like the past, the present, and the future here. Like we do have these old Hollywood legends, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn. We have these, women who are just hitting their stride, Geraldine Page, Lee Remick, and then Anne Bancroft really having this huge breakout role and someone the Academy would really love moving forward. I also think this is such like a theater-minded group where all of these performances feel like they could come from the stage if they didn't already, like if they weren't a straight adaptation. So strangely for me, it almost feels like a year where it doesn't feel like the classic thing of comparing apples and oranges like it does sometimes, where it's like, how do you compare Jennifer Lawrence with Jessica Chastain with Emmanuel Riva? Like, they're all doing such different things. Here, it's like these very dialogue-centric, heavyweight performances. And I guess my feelings on which one was like most impressive has changed as I've watched them over the years and then watching them again this week. So yeah, it's also, I think, a field where to keep comparing them, it's like most of these performances, it feels like, are dependent on their co-stars as well, in a way that I think does enhance their performances, which we will probably get into. So yeah, shall we jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay. Well, where else to start but the top here, the top story. Bette Davis. Whatever happened to Baby Jane?
Starting off strong.
Yes, coming in hot. So much to unpack here. So many angles we could talk about. I mean, first of all, for me, this is the final Bette Davis nomination at the Oscars. It is a true end of an era for this show and for one of the all-time greats. And I'm sad that it's over, but happy I've been able to have so many chances to discuss the great work of Bette Davis. And yeah, what a final nomination to go out on here. And it's also her first in 10 years after The Star. So it's cool to see, that kind of longevity that she had. She was also the first to 10 Oscar nominations of any actor. And so Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is a great one to close with, a bona fide classic, I would say. And we can finally properly get into the feud with Joan Crawford, which definitely helped to sell this movie to audiences, and they really made it a hit. So just to get into a little bit of background with this, Joan Crawford is the one who read the original novel of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and she proposed that Bette Davis should co-star with her. And the two of them weren't exactly friends. I would sort of say that they were rivals in a sense, not in a way that I think has been overinflated by the media and just the studios and everything to try to sell tickets. But there was some interesting stuff to do with, some of the men and their personal lives that I can't really speak to with confidence necessarily. I wasn't there, but generally speaking, it was a big event to see these two together for the first time, especially with all the rumors and the gossip that they hated each other. But let's talk about the film. Bette Davis is playing Baby Jane Hudson, who is a former child star who is now aging and is just filled with resentments about her now non-existent career. She was more or less rejected when she tried to become a Hollywood star in the 30s. And then meanwhile, her sister Blanche, played by Joan Crawford, was actually beloved and became a bit of a star. But there was one night after a party involving a car where Blanche broke her spine, with Jane kind of taking the blame out of jealousy. And the two of them now live together in this gothic mansion where Blanche is using a wheelchair and is really unable to do much of anything without the help of her sister, who just hates her and abuses her. And at one point, Jane tries to launch her big comeback by hiring this piano player to help get her back into shape vocal-wise, and it's very apparent that her time has passed, I would say. There's a whole lot more we can talk about that happens after that, but that's kind of the gist. So yes, let's get to it. Would love to know your feelings on Bette Davis, just as an icon, an actress, a legend, and what you think of her here in this final Oscar nomination.
Well, obviously, love Bette Davis. I am not... I haven't gone through her entire filmography, but what I have seen, is incredibly impressive, and she absolutely has earned the legend status that she has had over the years. And it's so fascinating to watch her in this movie because there is certainly a lot of the kind of old Hollywood style to her performance, but you do see how it can still work in this modern context. And there's an intentional juxtaposition, I think, to that performance in this modern time that works so well. And I really find that this performance is kind of deceptively layered to a point, because I think on the surface, people remember the very big moments of her acting in this. The makeup certainly does a lot of that heavy lifting too, I would say.
Yeah.
But I think especially towards the end, there is such a vulnerability that comes out from this very fractured persona. And it's still very heightened, I would say, but it does feel a little bit more of a dynamic portrait of this character than you might have anticipated from the very beginning, which does play it, I think, a little bit more on the broad side. Still very captivating, but I don't think quite as nuanced as it becomes towards the end of the film. And I think despite it even getting grandiose with its emotions, the fact that Davis can still find some of these layers to the character, I just find to be just so incredible and engaging to watch. And yeah, it is fitting that this is a final Oscar nomination for her, because I think it still shows you that she was still great even up until this modern age for her. And I think that it's a really fantastic performance.
Yeah, definitely. I love this performance. It's completely go for broke performance that I have to say, for as much as I've loved like a lot of the actresses I've talked about recently on this show, there's really no one who can match the sort of power, the magnetism, going completely vanity free of Bette Davis when she really just tears into a role like this. And she is really committed to this in a way that I find very juicy and very entertaining. For me, it's just like indulging in something that I know isn't like the healthiest, but that it just tastes so good that I can't help myself. Like Jane Hudson is like an actively terrible person, just like one of the worst characters in terms of morality that I've talked about on this show so far. But because Bette Davis knows what she's doing, I do think, yeah, she really kind of does give you that, but also the reason behind it. And we see how it is so rooted in that feeling of this very deep insecurity and self-loathing even, and jealousy. You know, I think with the character, like a lot of it has to do with her father really sort of like making her entitled as a child and sort of setting her up to have these very unrealistic expectations, and then following that with her resentment for the people in Hollywood for sort of rejecting her, more or less. And it's like all of that anger and that entitlement is just manifested here in her treatment of Blanche, who, I mean, like, she physically abuses, she calls her an idiot, she is constantly belittling her, she puts dead animals in her meals just for fun. You know, she takes away her telephone, like, she just completely controls her sister's entire life. And it's because I think she sort of is lacking that sense of control in her own life and her own wanting to restart her career and everything and just like be a person in the world. So that's why it's like, for me, those scenes of her just totally reveling in this abuse of her sister, like, they don't feel like she's just randomly torturing her because it's fun and she's bored. Like, it's all stemming from, I think, that pain very deep inside that even she might not even vocalize, you know?
Exactly. Like, this is a person who is so damaged and hurt because of things that were in her control that she sabotaged herself, and stuff that wasn't in her control. And, you know, not that this is a common story, but the idea of those older Hollywood actors that just had a difficult time getting work as they got older and did kind of become a little bit bitter. Like, you can imagine that person, you know, maybe not to the flamboyant degrees that we see depicted in the movie, but the idea of that person feels so real. And you give it to Bette Davis, and she could just make every single thing so captivating. Even when she's being a monster, she's being so evil, but it's delicious to watch her do it. And it's in a way that only Bette Davis seems to be able to do at times. And and then when you start to realize more of her emotional motivations, and you get her just full breakdown towards the end where her mind is just gone, you still feel so much sad there, and you still can't help but identify with her journey and her struggle. And even though it's come to this very tragic conclusion, there's still a sense of humanity there. And I find that to be actually the most compelling thing about the performance, is that the humanity never goes away. And I credit Davis so much for maintaining that all the way through to the very end of the movie. And it's so heartbreaking.
Yes, I agree. And I think it is worth noting that she is, working with all this makeup that's just been caked on at this point, and she has like so many sour expressions throughout the movie, and she's just lost all social graces. We get these like huge sort of uncomfortable close-ups of Bette Davis that really are showing the sort of clownishness of her makeup and how her hair, which is like stuck in that kind of schoolgirl curls. Betty also did all of her own makeup here to really play up the artifice of it. So there's just like a lot to take in just on the surface. But to your point, I think you still are able to find the humanity in it just whenever we linger a little too much on her face and it's, her face cracks a little bit. Those are the great moments that I love. I'm curious if the sort of surface level, I guess you could say, clownishness of it, do you find that to sort of enhance the performance? Or is it like a distraction? How do you sort of take it in?
I think that if you didn't have the second half where you do get a little bit more deeper with it, I think it would feel very broad and a bit distracting. It still helps with the character, and I do love the decision to kind of have this makeup feel so garish, and it sticks out even more. It feels like in this black and white photography, and it's so beautifully designed just for that purpose. And I think that in the beginning, as I said, it does go for a broader, I would say, even caricature of this type of character. But as it goes on, I think that Davis understands that you need to go into the deeper complexities of what this woman has been going through. And I think because of that, it feels more justified. It's almost like this front to just get you in the door to understand the broad basics of this woman. But then as the movie goes on, you understand more of her mental state, and you create this emotional bond that makes those decisions feel more justified in the end.
Right. Yeah. Which is why I think even though there is a reason that this performance has kind of been celebrated as like a camp, iconic kind of like caricature type of thing, it is worth noting that she is really fully committing to giving you a three-dimensional person beyond the caricature.
Exactly. Like everybody will pick out the moments from the first half of the movie. I feel like those are the big campy moments that we remember and that we love for sure. Like I'm not going to deny that either. But I do think that people who maybe dismiss it as just a broad campy performance are missing the subtleties that really do come out in the end, which is funny to say because like the ending of the movie still has very big grandiose moments to it as well, but there's just like these small glances on her face in some of those moments that I'm just like amazed that there's such nuance to that presentation, and you wouldn't think to find it anywhere in this movie because for the most part the movie's not very subtle at all, but she's still able to find it in these small sequences for her performance. It's amazing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think a lot of her interactions with people are fascinating as well. I mean, we can just talk here about her chemistry, I guess is the right word, with Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
I'm curious sort of what we think of just their dynamic, because I obviously find it to be very juicy, because for as much overinflation of the feud there's been, it's not like it totally came out of nowhere and is a complete lie. Like, they've both said that they are very different people. They have different processes. They are very different actresses who have different values. I think that just naturally kind of shows itself in these performances as well, where Joan Crawford, I think, is really carrying herself still with that sense of like dignity and just making sure all of her angles are in the right place, even though over time it's like she just becomes more and more ill and everything. So it's not like she can maintain that sense of glamour. But then you contrast that with what Bette Davis is doing, which is like, I don't care, just like vanity free, like I said. I think the two of them, even though they seem like such different people, kind of do have that sisterly bickering energy that works for me.
Yeah,
anyway.
and a lot of that I think you do kind of bring to the movie yourself.
Sure.
I mean, it's impossible to totally separate, the stories about that because it's just been so ingrained in pop culture for decades now. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think you find that dynamic present there. I think it could be a little stronger. Like I don't get the sense that they are like for me, I don't really get the sense that they really are that sisterly with one another. They definitely get the bickering down for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't know if I really get like a familial connection between the two of them all that much, but at the same time, we're still talking about two incredible actors just going at it,
Yeah.
towards one another, and that is going to be inherently engaging. And I think that even though I am missing maybe the more genuine connection to really sell this sisterly bond between them, I do find that their interactions serve the story and the narrative very, very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think by the end, I feel it maybe a little more. Obviously, the moment where Jane asks, like, you mean after all this time we could have been friends? The sort of
Oh yeah.
softening moment of that I find to be quite effective, at least. But yeah, I think it's just for me the general passion that they have for the craft, and they both the characters at least both went into acting. Obviously, they are these performers and everything. They both seem to have a passion, even though they have very parallel paths of going through that process. But yeah, I mean, the scenes for Betty with Victor Buono are some of my personal favorites, even though they're very silly. Her look of just like confusion almost when she opens a door and finds this character of Edwin, but then how we see that she starts to kind of soften a little bit when he just shows like a modicum of interest in her, I think is really a nicely crafted arc of her eventually kind of liking him in a way that is like kind of escalating quickly, but is sort of showing how she is so detached from reality and from other people who she can connect with, that anyone who pays just a little bit of attention to her and isn't overtly like disrespectful to her or anything is like, oh my god, I love you. you know
Exactly. Yeah, that moment when she opens the door actually might be my favorite moment of her performance because
yes.
it has to communicate so many different things where you're right, there is this shock and
Mm-hmm.
disappointment, but also the recognition that, well, somebody is here though, and this is somebody who might take some interest in me, and this is the
Right.
first time I've ever had this feeling in so long. And it's also sort of mirrored in his performance too. There's like kind of a similar roller coaster of emotions that he's going through as well. But
Yeah.
I that look that she gives and having to communicate all of these conflicting feelings in these very few glances is just masterclass in acting. And yeah, as the movie progresses and you get the sense of where she's really coming from, of what she wants out of this relationship with him, and as it is dissolving in front of her, how she has to reconcile with that, is just, my god, it is tragic, but it is so compelling too. And i
Mm-hmm.
am i am in awe of how she's able to navigate that.
Exactly. Yeah, that is really the moment where you realize that, this is why you hire Betty Davis, because she can give you
Yes.
that, even in the midst of all the silliness of everything else around it. But I mean, I do want to just pinpoint one of her better scenes as well, which is where she is navigating so many different emotions at once when she's performing I've Written a Letter for Daddy, and she's in her element again, and Edwin is playing the piano, and it feels like she's just in another world almost, and is really one of the happier points in this film for her. And Edwin's just kind of encouraging her because he wants that check, right? And
Exactly.
she obviously is taking a liking to him, but when he suggests like this will be a business relationship, and you see her disappointment there a little bit, but she kind of forges past that in a way and says that she'll pay him, and suddenly they're like friends again in a way. You see her really just like negotiating that scene and really navigating that relationship really well. I think that is another masterclass in terms of her crafting an arc just in one scene.
Oh, absolutely.
So
And how she like prods him a little bit of, oh, do you have a wife or a lady
yeah,
friend? And it's like, okay, well, it's business first, but there's an in, and you can see it, her working out the
hmm
plans. And yeah, her singing that song obviously is like one of the big moments of the movie. And
it's a lot. It's a
yeah,
lot.
it is a lot. It is. There's a reason why it tends to get cited
Yep.
much throughout the years in terms of kind of
hmm
one of the campier moments. But at the same time, there is another layer behind it, and you understand what she's going through. And it's not just supposed to be a big, silly, campy moment, that there is an actual character motivation behind this. And as you said, it's her going back to the happier times in her life, which it seems so far away now, but
hmm
she could tap into that. And even though it's in this sort of garish presentation, she doesn't care. She's only back into that mental space that she was before, and she can't see how ridiculous this looks, or how the Victor Buono character is also sort of disgusted and
hmm
repulsed by this. And so I find it to be another really fascinating moment that seems broad on the surface, but actually has a lot more underneath that's going on.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I've seen this film a number of times, but I feel like I go through so many different emotions just watching that one scene of her singing, which, to her credit, that is her real voice, just really unafraid to be like totally off key at everything and just really projecting. But I feel like the campiness of it, obviously it's so over the top, but you feel pity also, you feel a sadness and a desperation by the end, and it's just this really potent mix, I think, of all of these different emotions that she's able to convey just by singing and just giving it her all. And you're, in a way, you're almost happy for her too, that it feels like she's kind of accessing those previous emotions and that happiness. And the fact that I can feel that when I've been watching this film, where she is this like monstrous person, I think is a credit to Bette.
Yeah, the,
So
the lack of vanity, I think, is the key there,
yeah.
because you wouldn't expect it for somebody who was such a major star, even at this time, to allow herself to remove that layer to her, and people to see her in this different light. I mean, the fact that, there are clips of Bette Davis movies in this that they're like openly mocking, which is
Yeah.
fascinating. Like I can't imagine anybody else allowing that to happen. It's so interesting that Bette Davis is so committed to the portrait of this character that even something like that, real clips of her old performances being presented to be mocked in the movie, is just,
hmm
man, like, what an actress to be able to do that
I
at that
know.
time.
And by the way, just to touch on that, what a surreal moment that must have been just for people in 1962 watching that and actually seeing those younger versions of not only Bette but also Joan. Like, we
Yeah.
see, I think Sadie McKee is shown here, and she's just kind of looking at it lovingly on the TV and everything. I just can't even imagine like watching that in 1962 and sort of like reckoning with the fact that this is actually Bette and Joan that we're watching as earlier versions of themselves, and kind of how you feel even more immersed in the story because they allowed those clips to be shown.
Which then just kind of fuels the feud even more, of like, oh well, because
Yeah,
we are actually like seeing representations of their old Hollywood journeys, you kind of even then sort of imagine the connection between the two of them and their animosity even more. It feels even more
exactly.
real.
And that's also part of how I think this performance and this character connects with Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard, which we
Hmm.
talked about at length in that episode, of how she also had her own clips that were shown from the silent era. So I feel like that is such a potent thing that it feels like we don't really get anything like that anymore. That sense of connection and like using old clips from these actresses past. I don't know what that would look like in a modern film, but it's always fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting method to go about it, and I think it's even more interesting here because it's really meant, at least for the Jane Hudson character, to just be openly mocked and torn
Right.
apart, and
Yeah.
that feels even more subversive to
Mm-hmm.
me. Like, it's not just the fact that we're seeing these clips and recalling the real life history of these actresses. It's that for one of them, it's being used to say like, oh, look how bad she was, which
Yeah.
just feels like such a daring move for a very major Hollywood figure to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I really give her credit for being willing to risk that for the sake of the film and for her performance.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite side of Bette Davis, just in general, is when she's playing a character who really values her sense of control and then is finding that slipping away, which is what we see when the housekeeper, Elvira, comes around, who's been on to Jane for a while. Like, she has her number, and she's concerned about Blanche, who is like now tied up in her room so she can't escape after like trying to make a phone call. And just the sense of panic, not only there, but the previous scene of like trying to cash this check at the bank and sort of living off her sister's money more or less, but then later trying to get rid of Elvira. For me, it's just really striking to see her becoming more and more desperate as her sort of scheming is starting to really snowball out of control. And it's like she still has her convictions in that great sort of Bette Davis way, but she's such a live wire by that point that it's just like she's just having to go on instincts. Like, her big elaborate plan is starting to fall apart because getting rid of Elvira was not part of the plan, I don't think. Obviously, she wanted to get her out of her life, but not quite in the way that it happens here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love whenever like it feels like things are getting out of control, because you really are seeing her having to act on impulse.
Yeah, the unraveling that she goes through is, I mean, yeah, it is very compelling. I will say that the Elvira subplot I do sometimes have mixed feelings on, just because that's, especially the resolution when she does eventually kill her, it does
Yep.
swerve into like horror movie territory that, I mean, there's sort of this dark specter around the entire movie, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't become like quite that outlandish with some of those elements until we get to that part. And for as grandiose as the movie is at times, I don't know if it ever really justifies crossing over into that territory all that much for me. But we do get this great presentation from Bette Davis's performance, and yeah, that just losing control and how quickly that lost grip is
Mm-hmm.
really slipping away from her. I just find that to be really interesting. I think the narrative construction to get there, I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
fully on board with that, but the end result I think is still really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the process of it all is a little sweaty, I would say, in general. Just the amount of steps that have to be taken to get there is. I get what you're saying. I do think there is just a desperation with that character, though, that it didn't seem that out of character for me that she would go to such lengths, honestly, considering just where she is at that point in the story. But yeah, after that, it's really just kind of like trying to be, not found essentially by the police in a sense. And it sort of becomes a different kind of story, I would say, by the end. But I do think, that really lovely scene on the beach with the two of them, where, I mean, Blanche is just like on death's door basically, and she's just like laying there and like barely even conscious. But that really touching moment of when it's finally revealed that Blanche is the one who was responsible for her own injuries, and that she kind of let Jane take the blame, more or less feeling just out of hurt feelings because Jane was making fun of her at a party. Even though, I mean, it's been a resentful thing since childhood that we sort of get at the beginning, but it's still an interesting twist. I don't know if I saw that coming when I first saw it, but I do think, just to speak to the Blanche characterization, it sort of makes sense that she would put up with Jane's bullshit for so long, because I think you see maybe some of the guiltiness going on there, that guilt conscious of feeling like, oh, I kind of let this lie get out of control, and now here we are so many years later.
Yeah, it completely retextualizes the whole movie and
Right.
their entire dynamic. And it does give you a greater appreciation of, yeah, as you said, why she kind of tolerates all the things that
Hmm.
that Jane has been doing to her.
Right.
But you get a greater understanding of her character, of Jane's character, and it does deepen the movie to a great degree. And yeah, you save it for the very end, which makes it all the more powerful and gives, man, like, because yeah, the final moments of this movie I do find to be just so engaging, and
Hmm.
the performances from both of them, but I do think particularly from Bette Davis and how she's able to take in that news, but also still dealing with all of the emotional damage that has already been done is just such another wonderful moment from her. It
Hmm.
just once again proves her abilities as a performer.
Yeah. And I think that final twist really works because it's not like it's necessarily pulling the wool out from under us as an audience, even though I mean it is, but it's like Jane is realizing this as we are as well, so it doesn't feel like just a twist for twist's sake necessarily, like they're withholding something from the audience. So that's
Yeah,
why I think it works.
yeah, because even in the beginning of the movie, when you see that sequence, you don't see anybody's faces. You just see hands and parts of that sequence. So it keeps it vague in the beginning, and in a weird way, it almost like kind of indicts the audience a little bit because it's like, well, you just assumed that this is how it was, like
Right.
everybody else did, because you're going off of what you think you know about these characters. And nope, turns
Yeah.
out that was more complicated than it actually was. So it is a really fascinating way to end the movie that does make the storytelling a lot more complex.
Yeah, I love the ending, and not only that, I think it's so well written in a way that I find the fact that she is like Jane is just sitting there on the beach in plain sight of everyone. And
Yes.
she's supposed to be like this wanted person, and the police aren't really able to find her until there's like this indication of the car. The fact that she's just sitting there in plain sight, she for so long she's felt like, oh, the public, I'm like, there's these little scenes where it's like, oh, you probably remember me and everything, but like nobody recognizes her, even though she looks, a certain way. Like
Yeah.
she's very distinct looking compared to everyone else on the beach and everything. It's like there's something really kind of darkly tragic about the fact that she could just like sit there like anyone else, even though she was a big star, and she feels like she can still be a big star, and now nobody even knows her from anyone else.
Yeah, the fact that she just blends into the crowd despite looking like that is just a further
Yeah.
emphasis of how much she has really been forgotten by the public.
Yeah. And then of course we get the fully like slipping into delusion kind of thing where it does mirror her performing the Daddy song earlier, where she's just like she's just slipped into that childhood fantasy again, performing for everyone because now everyone's paying attention to her. It's some nice dark twisted irony that I love to see. And yeah, she fully commits to it. I love this performance. I think, yes, it is a lot to take in and it is over the top, but I think it's the right frequency for not only the character but just the kind of film that this is. So
There is a lot of range here, which you would
yeah.
not think just
No, you
based
would
on the
not.
reputation of the performance.
Right. So like I said, I mean, Bette Davis is a legend, and I'm so happy that she was nominated for this and that she got this final nomination to show that she still had it and she would continue to have it. Like she would continue acting into the 80s. Maybe she didn't get the sense of acclaim that this one did after this, but basically, I just feel like it's been such a pleasure to watch her over 30 years of her career really just committing full force to every role, at least that she's been nominated for. Like, there's never a dull moment for me in a Bette Davis performance that I've
Completely
talked about,
agree.
at least. So,
Yeah.
and I'm sad that this is it for her, but happy that she went out on this note. More on the Joan Crawford feud later on as we talk about the actual Oscars. So we'll put
Yeah.
a pin in that. This is not the end of the story there. Shall we move on to our next nominee?
Let's.
All right. Well, we replace one heavyweight legend with another one. Katharine Hepburn in Long Day's Journey into Night. So, speaking of a lot to get into, Long Day's Journey into Night is this widely celebrated play by Eugene O'Neill, here getting its first of multiple film adaptations, with Katharine Hepburn really, taking on one of the more challenging parts of her career, I would say. And she is continuing this really great hot streak of her career as this sort of seasoned veteran who is commanding a lot of respect. Her previous nomination was for Suddenly Last Summer, another theatrical kind of film, and this really takes it to a whole other level. And speaking of people with long Oscar track records, this is her 9th Oscar nomination, and it's also the last time she's nominated without winning, because her last 3 nominations she wins for, which is wild that it's like, I'm going to win for my first one, and then I'm going to get 8 more nominations, and then I'll just win for my last 3,
Legend.
But that's Katharine for you, I do think you can see why, especially after this performance, there was, I would imagine, a feeling among voters that, like, we have to give her another one soon. It's been so long since Morning Glory. But let's talk about it, though. A Long Day's Journey into Night. It's about the Tyrone family. James Tyrone is an actor, and his best days are behind him. His wife is Mary Tyrone, played by Katharine Hepburn. She has a morphine addiction, which she developed after the birth of her youngest son, Edmund, who has grown up now but has battles of his own, including tuberculosis. And there's the eldest son, Jamie, who sort of takes after his father, but is also like a womanizer. He's addicted to alcohol. There's all kind of resentment among the family, basically due to them not really being able to have the kind of lives that they want, either as a family or as individuals. And it all takes place during one very long day that goes into night, as they just hash out all of their feelings and slip into despair, as one does. Let's talk Katharine Hepburn here. Would love to obviously know your thoughts on her as this iconic actress and your feelings on this very weighty film and performance.
Well, do love Katharine Hepburn. As I mentioned before, she has my favorite Oscar win of all time, in The Lion in Winter. So I am a fan of hers. I do really like her. The performance in this movie, well, first of all, this movie is a lot.
I mean, Speaking of a lot, yeah.
It is almost 3 hours long. It's very heavy subject matter. Every single character has so much baggage to them, and they go on very, very long dialogue sequences to explain everything that is wrong with them. And it's hard to deny, though, how powerful it is. And like every moment that Katharine Hepburn is on screen is just one that you just can't take your eyes away from. She just is another one that just has that magnetic quality that is just impossible to look away. Mm-hmm. I will say that this is definitely a performance that does feel quite theatrical and is going for those really big moments at times. And that to me is not always the most compelling thing to witness. And I think there are moments where, for me, I do kind of get lost in some of the more histrionic notes. But at the same time, I can't deny that she is doing a phenomenal job here. But I will admit that it probably is not going to go down as one of my favorite Hepburn performances, just because I think the material itself is so big that I don't tend to jive with it all that much, but I still like her in the film for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely get that. For me, I mean, this is like a towering performance. There's just so much to it that I would say that it's almost an unfair advantage that she has compared to everyone else, of just being able to really go through every emotion, all of these traumas. She's screaming, she's crying, she's monologuing, she's slipping into a state of delusion. She has subtle moments, these, moments of tenderness. It's like this mammoth kind of showcase for her. And by the end, I'm drained. Like, I'm exhausted. Yeah. I feel so spent, which I do think is intentional from Eugene O'Neill and his original text and everything. I think he wants you to feel as drained as these characters are by the end of this very long night, where so much emotion, so many hurt feelings and anger, all of these things are being expressed. And it was very clear to me watching this, because this was my first experience with Long Day's Journey into Night, really in any form, but it was very apparent that if you have the wrong actors doing this, or just actors who don't have the range, or I would say the stamina to pull this off, I think this is a torturous experience. But
Yeah.
when you put Katharine Hepburn in this part of Mary Tyrone, someone who knows what they're doing, and is capable of that sort of haughtiness and anger and brittleness and pretentiousness too, and these moments of like levity and everything, I do think it works. There is a reason why I think the character of Mary Tyrone is sort of regarded as one of the great parts in theater for a woman. There is that brittleness, like she's always on the edge of falling apart, and she's like brushing her hair out of her face. There's a lot that is required, not only physically but emotionally, and she like thinks everyone is spying on her, no one is believing her, she's spiraling. I do love the way that there's one scene towards the beginning where Sidney Lumet and his camera is sort of following her around as she goes around and around her living room as she's really spiraling. And there is like a volatility, I think, that we really haven't seen as much before from Katharine Hepburn, at least on screen. She keeps going back to this point of how her family doesn't want to leave her alone in this house because they're afraid of what she might do, and it kind of scares her. I feel like, I don't know about you, but over the course of a scene or even like a monologue, I found myself sympathizing with her, being turned off by her, being concerned for her. It's like this constantly evolving feeling, and it's just so erratic. And there are moments where it feels like it is so all over the place that I just am almost getting lost in exactly what the intention is here. But I guess there's intention behind it feeling erratic,
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the character is going through a lot for sure. Like so many of these characters are. But
Yeah.
I think for her, yeah, every moment that you see her, you kind of are on this nice edge as to where she's going to land with a particular moment. And I swear it feels like every single scene she is on the verge of tears. I feel like there are,
Yeah.
like every moment with Katharine Hepburn, she is misty-eyed and sad about everything. But it does keep you invested. And I do think that there are times when, as you said, you can get lost a little bit in the intentionality of where the character is actually supposed to be going. And because there is so much going on with this character, and I think sometimes that is tough to navigate, but she does make it work. Like every time she's on screen, she is absolutely the one that you are paying attention to, no matter who else is her scene partner. And to me, the big tragedy is just that there's a large chunk of this movie without her. And I mean, I'm still invested in that part of the story, but you do kind of miss her presence throughout a large section of this film.
Yeah, the last act, she is just completely off screen until the end, which feels like, I mean, I don't know, it's like 45 minutes, I would say, of this 2 hour, 50-minute movie. So she still has a lot of screen time. But yeah, it feels like the classic Allison Janney and I, Tonya thing of like, I feel my storyline's disappearing.
Yeah.
As these men are taking over and everything. But yeah, I mean, before we delve into what I think is a really dynamic knockout final scene for her, I do just want to highlight a few scenes. I mean, we can't talk about everything because there's just so much and we would get bogged down in too many details. But some of my favorite moments are when she isn't necessarily going to those highs and she's deliberately choosing those moments to go smaller and more internal. Like a scene towards the beginning, middle-ish, where she's talking with her husband about her addiction to morphine, and she just whispers her line, which she says, "I tried so hard, please believe me." And it's just this really disquieting moment, and you really feel the desperation there. Those are those smaller moments, or those moments of silence, really, are for me the standout parts, because so much of the rest of the performance is so big and so rambling and everything. I think that's probably why those moments of subtleness and quiet are the ones that just sort of naturally stand out, I guess.
Yeah,
So,
very effective in those quieter moments, but she can also still find it in the bigger moments too when she's doing that
mhm.
rambling. And one that sticks out to me is when she's going through the death of her child and kind of the guilt that she
Oh my
feels
God.
about even
Yeah.
having children after her first son. And it's a big moment for sure.
Mhm.
Very kind of theatrical in its execution, but you understand the turmoil behind every single thing that she is saying, and you are hanging on every single word that she's saying as well. And even though it is the more erratic presentation, I still found it to be rooted in very particular character bits that I just also found so fascinating at the same time.
Yes. There's another line that I pinpointed that I think is from that part of the film as well, where it's before she's about to go out and go on a drive to get more morphine, and she says, "We've loved each other, we always will. Let's remember only that and not try to understand what we cannot understand or help things that cannot be helped. The things life has done to us, we cannot excuse or explain." These things I feel like very painful, very vulnerable stuff, very raw in a way that feels more outside of the old Hollywood studio system style of acting of her beginnings. Like when she's talking about like the filthy hotels where she was traveling with her husband and how this sort of cheap hotel doctor was the cause of everything, the addiction. There's, yeah, obviously the past trauma of their dead baby who died of measles, which Jamie accidentally gave to the baby, and how it was hard for her to forgive him. Like there's so much, and the dialogue itself I think is so theatrical in a way that I think, again, if this is in another actor's hands, could feel incredibly phony in its presentation. But I think because of the sort of haughtiness of Katharine Hepburn that's really been with her since her beginning. She's sort of been either accused of being kind of haughty and putting on airs and whatnot, or she's kind of been celebrated for that being her screen persona. I think that part of it, she sort of lends that air of theatricality to it, to where it makes sense that, this person would be expressing themselves in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also wonder how much of that is also just the fact that this is a Sidney Lumet film, and his sensibilities as a filmmaker
Yeah.
also sort of defied certain expectations and evolved throughout the times. And the early 60s, as you are aware, is this really fascinating transition era,
Mm-hmm.
especially with content that you could even show an audience. So I find that the filmmaking itself is something that really adds to the performances of everybody here, but I think especially hers, that she can sell these moments that normally would feel very, very false in anybody else's hands, but she's able to make it work so beautifully.
And I think a great example of that is she has this very fragile conversation with Edmund about how the doctor told her how important it was to not have distractions when she got home from the sanatorium, which is during her recovery, but that his own issues and his sickness was really kind of consuming her, which partly caused her to have this addiction. And it's like she hopes that he knows that it's not her fault, but also she can't blame him for thinking that she was blaming him for it. It's this very complex kind of web of emotions that she's having to navigate there. And I think she really commands and really navigates really well because, she treats her as a smart and perceptive person, even if she is kind of always on that knife's edge, but, is someone who is stuck in that sickness. And so there is this sort of fragility too. And we're seeing both the strength and the vulnerability kind of being expressed all at the same time, which is also in Act 3, where she really goes way into her backstory, of, playing piano at the convent and talking very nostalgically about her time as this musician and how she wanted to be a nun. And now, like, the pain in her hands is preventing her from playing piano, which is this sort of source of regret for her and how her life turned out. And she talks about meeting her husband and how handsome he was and everything, and how the morphine is allowing her to stay in the sort of, I guess, warmth of the past rather than the pain, I guess, of the present. And this is, I think, one of many huge monologue driven scenes that should probably grow tiring or stale as it goes on and on and on and on. But I do just find her to be really riveting, just in the way she's able to sort of like spin this web like, you know, like a great storyteller would. And it's like, even when she may be lying, like when she tells Kathleen that her arthritis in her hands is why she needs the morphine, something like that, she's like so convincing, even in that sense of delusion, or at least in her maybe pretending for Kathleen, that you almost kind of believe her, or at the very least you're just, for me, riveted by her. And I feel like she, for me, kind of towers over the other performers in the sense that I really do miss her when she's gone. And I feel like the other actors aren't quite able to reach that level of investment for me. Like, even if I wasn't just watching this for Katharine Hepburn's performance, I still feel like Mary Tyrone is kind of the only one for me that has interest.
Yeah, I feel like the other characters, once we start to really dive into their dynamics, it's a little bit more standard, a little bit more plain. And I think those actors are doing good work, but I absolutely agree that you miss her presence. There definitely is a stark change in how much I'm invested in this story once she's not here anymore. And I think that's one of the reasons why maybe this performance, in the kind of totality of Katharine Hepburn's work, maybe isn't talked about as much as it should be, because I think the movie itself does suffer from her absence, and it just really is hard to get invested in these other storylines. But I think there's no question that she is by far the most interesting aspect to any of these characters.
Yeah, I would say so. Although I do think the sort of exchange that she has with Edmund, where he tells her that he has to go away to get treated as well, and she just won't accept it. She won't hear him be morbid, you know? And there's this line that he says, "It's hard to take sometimes having a dope fiend for a mother." And she just like turns ice cold, and that stare that she has off into the distance, I think, is chilling. She sort of is talking to herself about doing an overdose, and it's like these are the moments for me in the film where I imagine it's such a draining experience playing this character. Definitely more so on the stage, obviously, because it has to be all in one night. But yeah, I just feel drained watching this performance, and I do think intentionally uncomfortable.
Yeah, it definitely works you over. Like, I feel like the whole movie does. I mean, it's a very overwhelming experience. You know, this almost 3-hour drama with all of these very heavy things happening to these characters. And yeah, I do think that at some points it is a little much to bear. I do think that we feel the draining stamina along with the performers and these characters just as an audience member as well. And I do think that does lose me occasionally, but there are certainly moments where it will pull me back, and almost all of them are with whatever Hepburn is doing.
Completely. Which is how I felt by the end of the film, which we should talk about here, where she disappears for so long. She's upstairs and she's fully doped up at this point, and it's just like we're just watching the men kind of talking about their own failed dreams and whatnot, and how their own lives are disappointments, and they all resent each other. But she finally does come back downstairs, and she has her wedding dress that she's dragging behind her, and goes to play the piano, and it's not very good. And yeah, I mean, she's just completely trapped in the past, much like, you know, Jane Hudson in a way. These characters end in a similar fashion of just sort of reverting to the past. Also, like a Gloria Swanson, Sunset Boulevard, Vivien Leigh, Streetcar Named Desire moment, or even Catherine herself at the end of Suddenly Last Summer, where it's like something's just snapped in her and she is just back to her former life before all of the morphine and all the disappointment and everything. And yeah, she has that final monologue at the end, which, you know, Sidney Lumet sort of pulls away from gradually, and it creates this sort of effect that's like, these people are in hell. Yeah, this was a descent into hell, and now we're pulling back finally.
Yeah, but then we still get that one final moment where well, not final, but we pull back, but then we also snap into a close up of everybody
yes.
too, to kind of just bring us back to the present that they are actually in as well. And
Right.
it's jarring, but also so revealing for where those characters are. And I remember watching it because this was also the first time I had seen it. And yeah, you just sort of get used to this rhythm of pulling back and kind of dissolving into this outer space. And then you're immediately shoved right back into the intimate space of these characters. And to get that also represented on her face, and you see the subtlety come back, it's like it's a really unexpected moment, but is so effectively delivered, and a great emphasis on her performance as well.
Right. And I think very generous on Sidney Lumet's part to give her that final close up and the final word, in a sense, and you're feeling the impact of it because of how jarring it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, as we've discussed, this is a tough watch. Definitely, for me, the toughest watch of these 5 films by a mile.
I would agree. Yeah.
For a number of reasons. But I do think if you love Katharine Hepburn, I think this is just one of those unique performances of her really just plumbing the depths of her talent and really exposing so much as an actress in a way that I don't think that she had done as much at that point in her career. And I think we would get, certain elements of this in The Lion in Winter, obviously, in terms of the theatricality of it. But this is one that feels very unique for me in her filmography.
Yeah, I would say that it's a great performance. I wish the movie around her was matching her level, and I think that is kind of my disappointment with it as I walked away from the film. But I certainly won't deny that she's great. I just sort of wish the movie around her was at the same level, especially when we get this very long stretch without her, and it feels like it's just not as an interesting film at that point.
Yeah, I would agree. But I just want to note one other thing, that the fact that we're talking about this feels slightly relevant, considering, as you may know, there is going to be another film adaptation of Long Day's Journey into Night in 2023 with Jessica Lange.
I could see that. That makes sense.
Reprising her Tony-winning performance.
Yeah.
So that will be an interesting one to sort of contrast, looking at what her choices and everything.
Yeah, because you could already imagine that performance on screen.
Yeah,
and
I can.
Yeah, I would be. I don't know if I'll have the stamina to sit through all of it. We'll have to see, but I'm definitely intrigued.
We'll see. Yeah. Well, at least now you'll have something to compare it with, whenever and if ever you do watch that version. I believe Ed Harris is with her in that, so that'll be interesting too.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to see that.
Yes. All right, let's move on to our next nominee, Miss Geraldine Page for Sweet Bird of Youth. Geraldine Page, I'd say, is on a roll at this point in her career. She already had a previous nomination for Hondo in the 50s. Then she gets her first lead nomination in 1961 for Summer and Smoke. And now here she is the very next year for Sweet Bird of Youth. And these are her first 3 roles in film that she gets Oscar nominations. So I think there is a level of respect that is growing and growing for Geraldine Page. And much like Summer and Smoke, she had already starred in Sweet Bird of Youth on the stage, so she is reprising her role here. And I also wanted to note that this is another end of an era here, because, believe it or not, this is the last time that a Tennessee Williams adaptation is nominated in Best Actress.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, just to recap, we had Streetcar Named Desire, The Rose Tattoo, Baby Doll, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Suddenly Last Summer, Summer and Smoke, and now Sweet Bird of Youth. So it is the end of this major kind of trend that dominated the 50s and 60s, and specifically in this category too. So yeah, let's talk about Sweet Bird of Youth. It's about this guy named Chance, played by Paul Newman, who sort of wants to make it big in Hollywood, but it's not really working out. he goes back to his hometown alongside this movie star, Alexandra Delago, played by Geraldine Page. And she is addicted to alcohol and drugs, and she is sort of coming off this attempt to launch a comeback, which she feels has failed, so she wants to just sort of give up her dreams and retire. Meanwhile, he's hoping that she can try to get him sort of an opportunity in the business, so they shack up in a room together where she pretty much stays for the vast majority of the film while he goes off and does other things. And some of his other things include getting back involved with his former flame, Heavenly, but is also sort of dealing with her terrible father, played by Ed Begley. The film is mostly about the Paul Newman character, but Geraldine Page does, I think, get a decent amount of screen time to probably justify a lead placement. I don't know, maybe we'll have that discussion. What are your thoughts here on Geraldine Page as an actress and her performance here in Sweet Bird of Youth?
I mean, I do like Geraldine Page. I will admit, not very familiar with her entire filmography, but what I have seen, I have been impressed with. As far as this movie, I feel like I went on kind of a journey as I was watching it, because this was one of the other ones that I had not seen previously and saw for the first time this week leading up to this discussion. And I don't think the movie itself is that good. Oftentimes it actually felt like kind of knockoff Tennessee Williams, and to know that it's actually him, I don't know, it did not really engage me all that much. I found most of the characters to be very flat, and most of the resolutions are like kind of expected and not interesting, particularly for me. But what's fascinating is that when it comes to the Geraldine Page character, I was initially sort of ready to kind of write her off and be like, this feels like it's very broad, and it does kind of feel borderline supporting too, which I did sort of have that feeling. But as it went on, not that it really got to be that much more of a complex character, but I did feel like her just screen presence was pulling me in so much more. And she did surprisingly become one of the elements of this film that I did find myself connecting with, even though it wasn't, I think, the most compelling thing I could attach myself to. I was impressed with how much I was getting invested in what she was presenting to us with this character, even though I don't think the character itself is particularly well written. And that is definitely a mark of great talent, that I could get somewhat engaged by a character that I don't think is very well written, but really is all based on the performance. So not the best, I would say, but certainly a lot better than I was expecting as I was heading into the film.
Yeah, I do think she is definitely elevating this character from what is written. And I also just want to say, first of all, that I feel like Geraldine Page in Sweet Bird of Youth invented Jessica Lange. Especially the Jessica Lange that she would sort of become in American Horror Story and all her work with Ryan Murphy, right? Like this kind of stylized sort of diva type of performance, the theatricality, this whole thing where she's like holding on to her past and her fading youth and everything. Yeah, all of that I see in Geraldine Page here in this performance, and I think she is the best part of the film, which is flawed. I agree. And
to be generous.
Not everything really comes alive for me, but I think every time we go back to her, the film does become more alive, I would say. She just has so much screen presence here that I thought was lacking in Summer and Smoke, to be honest. Maybe it's just that this character is more confident in herself, that I felt sort of more confident in her performance and the way that she carries herself, but she does carry herself like a grande dame, kind of like what the role requires, not really in like a artificial putting on airs way, but this feeling of like, I know I'm a star. I'm used to getting attention. I know I have skills, but now I'm in this bad place in my life where I don't know if the people want me anymore.
Exactly.
It's like the classic sort of insecure actor kind of disposition she has, where it's like 1 minute you're confident in your abilities, the people love you, you're getting all this praise, and then suddenly it's like a comment or two negative could just completely set you off balance and send you into a spiral, which is where we sort of first meet her here, just completely drunk, having no idea what's going on. She's in this car with Paul Newman. She's like begging him for a drink. And yeah, like eventually she wakes up and becomes more sober. She has no idea who this guy is. She seems like mentally unsound, but she has like a kind of diva gravitas to her. Like she's speaking with a weightiness, I think, that really shows how much this person has lived a life. It's not like the kind of airiness of Summer and Smoke where it just feels almost alien in a way. I don't know about you, but I feel like in the early goings, especially, I found myself really wanting to go back to this character just because, like, I love Paul Newman. We love Paul Newman. This is not one of my favorite performances from him necessarily.
No, I think he's bad in the movie, honestly.
Okay, well, there you go. There's probably a reason that he wasn't nominated for this. I think Ed Begley is fine here. I don't really get the Oscar win necessarily. That whole thing is just not as interesting to me as the movie seems to think it is. So
yeah, not really a fan of most of the other characters in this movie that just feel like kind of carbon copies of other Tennessee Williams famous characters, just nowhere near as interesting or compelling. And I think that the Geraldine Page role is also another one that feels very familiar. Like I think you could absolutely track the arc of this character, and even like I feel like there's even some contrivances to get her there. Like I just find it so funny when she runs out that movie theater because 3 people like said some snide comment, and that sends her out. Like I mean, nobody like tried to get in contact with her. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know they tried to, but just it's very silly, the construction of, I think, how to get this character into this particular point in the story. But her performance definitely elevates this material. And I agree that there is just something about her poise and how you understand the confidence and vulnerability that is sort of clashing at the same time. And I think that is what endears me to her. It's certainly not the writing. It's certainly not the construction of this character, but the way that she is able to embody these complexities in a way that is not present in the material is very, very impressive.
Yeah. And I think she manages to carry off this idea where she said there's this discussion towards the beginning where he calls her like a nice monster, and she sort of laughs and says she was born a monster. Like she's just very confident in that. And I love the scene where she puts on her little cat eye glasses and she kind of like looks him up and down. And for him, it's like, he's like, yeah, I know I'm hot shit. Like I'm Paul Newman, you know? And she clearly likes what she sees. But she says like, I may have done better, but God knows I have done worse. That's another scene I'm going to keep coming back to it, where she feels so much like Jessica Lange, especially here, like this kind of almost southern gentility sort of thing mixed with that stormy, tempestuous kind of quality to her. I just love seeing that side of Geraldine Page. And to speak to the flashback sequence where she's, you know, launching her big comeback, and we see the nerves there of knowing that this is her big shot to really get this comeback that she has been wanting, and it's like she better not blow it. And there's this sort of implication where we come back to the present that she feels like she did blow it and she wants to sort of forget about it. And yeah, there is that other flashback scene of her in the movie theater where she's just like a bundle of nerves, and you see that insecurity coming through there. And I do think the actual comment that the audience member says is quite funny, just the way it's expressed. Like, Alexandra Delago, I thought she was dead. It's just, all of that is enough to just ruin the whole experience and just rushing out of the theater. I mean, I don't know if we need these sort of flashback scenes. I think it maybe could have been even more effective as just her own recollection of it and her just saying what happened and her own perception of it.
Yeah. I think that would have been way more effective than actually seeing it, because us actually seeing it is, as we said, it's very silly and ridiculous. I do kind of like at least the scene on the movie set where they do the take and then they have to do it again because the lighting's not right, and you understand how she perceives that and how she's interpreting what that is supposed to mean about how she is being presented. And I like that moment. Isn't enough to really justify its inclusion with also the theater scene.
No.
Probably not, but I will say like that one moment I think is very well done. But yeah, the other flashback I think is it's very ridiculous. It shouldn't have been in there.
Yeah, it very much strikes me as like we're going to try to open up this play to include more than
Yes,
just hotel scenes for her.
it definitely has that
Yeah.
feeling to it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, we get this other sequence of how he's taping her talking about smuggling in this hash into the country to try to like blackmail her, basically. But I love the way she sort of turns it right back on him and is like, I'm in control here. Like, she has the money that he wants. And that on some level, she knows that he's only really in this for her money and her access to this world that he wants into. And I love how she really just weaponizes that here, that like she has no shame. She's unapologetic about being selfish and sort of finding a way to get what she wants. I think she inhabits that. It's not really something I can point to and say exactly what she's doing, but it just is like she has this commanding confidence, I think, that shows when I look at this performance versus what she's doing in Summer and Smoke. It just feels like two very different people, which is a credit to, you know, her range. She knows what this character needs.
Right. She always feels like she's looking to get the upper hand in every situation, even when she clearly is at her most vulnerable. She always wants to feel like she knows what's going on and she's in command, even when she has difficulties showing it. Like that scene when Rip Torn bursts into her room and is intimidating her. Like you see, she absolutely is just so taken aback by what's happening, and you can see that she's nervous about it. But also, it's like I still have to maintain this control. I still have to look like I'm in, in my complete faculties in this moment, even when I'm terrified. And that's a tricky thing to pull off. And I do think that she manages to have that in pretty much every scene of this movie.
Right. Yeah. Even in the scenes where she's sort of opening up and exposing some vulnerability and sort of telling the Paul Newman character that she's finding herself liking him. And she says to him, like, I felt something for somebody besides myself, which could really be like this ridiculous sort of ironic type of line, but I think she makes it feel authentic because we've seen how much they are weirdly alike in the sense that they're kind of like these dreamers. They're going to give it another shot even after all these years to like be somebody. But he obviously has much more interest in Heavenly, which is a that character name. I just can't get past it.
Yeah. Once again, sounds like Tennessee Williams knockoff.
Chance and Heavenly. Yeah. It feels like a parody. But yeah, he's just not really able to listen to her and all her warnings. For me, my favorite scene of her is when she's getting the phone call from, I think it's Walter Winchell, and he's telling her that, yeah, her comeback is like happening. Like the reviews have been great. And she's almost moved by it as she's sort of listening and taking it all in. And she's kind of doing that thing of laughing through tears, you know, and telling him to like read the reviews. And it's like, who cares what they say? But also like, what did they say?
Right. Seeing her like the light kind of come back, that fiery passion that is like that is inflating her confidence, not in a superficial way, but actually feels more genuine. And seeing that slowly come back throughout the course of that conversation is so compelling to watch. I do think, once again, the writing to get us to this moment, I don't know if that was all that great, but watching her performance and also how she's completely dismissive of the Paul Newman character at that point too, and you get the realization of like, no, this isn't about you anymore. This is all about me. And it, it hasn't fully like totally clicked in for him yet, but it has kind of for her, but she's holding on to it. Like another like really wonderful sequence to see play out.
Yes. I mean, just to speak again to the writing, she explicitly says, just a short while ago, I needed you. Now I need nobody. Like, I don't know if we need to really have that spelled out. Like, that's already been indicated. But with how, like, selfish he is and how he's, like, begging her to mention him on the phone with Walter, basically using her to get what he wants, I don't mind, really, when at the end she's like, I'm out of here. Peace and love. Never setting foot in this town again. Like, I don't need you anymore. I just love that conclusion. Even though they do have this sort of moment of recognition where they kind of like share that meaningful glance by the end, I just love that she's just like, whatever. I'm probably never going to see you again, but that's fine.
Yeah, or that the only good you are now is just as my driver, an occasional lover. But
well,
soon
yeah.
I'll get tired of you with that, and we'll move on, and I'll be better. Her confidence is like fully to the point now of self-centeredness, but like not that you identify with that, but you understand why she would arrive at that point for her emotional journey. And I think it is credit to her ability as an actor that she can still keep that so compelling, even though the material doesn't really justify it itself.
Right. So I do think, actually, much like a lot of her nominations, at least, she is doing a lot of the heavy lifting when the film itself is not quite on her level.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that this movie would have been so much better had it just been more focused on her and really emphasized her as a lead in the movie, because I do think you can make an argument that she is kind of borderline supporting in this film.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about her dynamic within the film, I think there is a version of this story that completely excises the entire plot line she has. And it's just about him in this hometown and reuniting and everything, and this weird like political subplot going on too. It's not like she interacts much with anyone else outside of him. So,
yeah. It does feel very tangential to what seems like the main story of this movie is, but ironically it is the most interesting part of this movie. And
exactly.
And I think that is all because of her, because I think without that performance this would feel very unnecessary and a distraction. But as it is, it's like, no, give me more of that, please. Maybe not when she goes down to the bar and falls over. Like that's the one note where I'm like, okay, this is a little much. I don't think this is all that effective, but everything else is really good.
That's fair. One other thing I wanted to mention, it's very stupid, but I wrote it down because it made me laugh. There's a moment after they have sex and they like talk about making a movie together, and she says something that's like, a movie with our special talents would be banned worldwide.
Yeah.
I'm like, damn, okay. Getting a little racy.
Yep, that definitely feels like a line that would not have been there in the 50s adaptations of Tennessee Williams.
That is also what I thought too. Like, we're really towing the line here.
Yep, yeah. I mean, it's that transition area where we're poking at the censors a little bit more now.
Oh, yes. Okay, well, that's pretty much all I have on Geraldine Page, so I think it's time to move on to our final losing nominee, Lee Remick, in Days of Wine and Roses. She is the only one of this group that was a one and done with the Oscars, but she certainly had a strong career from the start. You know, her film debut being a face in the crowd, working with some greats, you know, Elia Kazan, Otto Preminger, here with Blake Edwards. She'd been in Anatomy of a Murder, which was a Best Picture nominee. She got a Golden Globe nomination for that. And also, it did not come as a surprise to me to learn that she studied at the Actors Studio. I think that is quite apparent in her performance here. In a good way. That's not me being shady, but it's just, you can sort of sense that from certain actors at this stage in cinema. But yeah, she really was a part of this new Hollywood group of actors, not really refined by the sort of classic studio system necessarily. But yeah, to get into Days of Wine and Roses, it's about this PR salesman played by Jack Lemmon who is addicted to alcohol, and he meets the secretary Kirsten, played by Lee Remick, and they form a relationship. They get married, and he introduces her to alcohol, which eventually turns into an addiction of her own. They have a child together, but they can't really function without a glass of something in their hand, which proves detrimental to both of their lives, personally and professionally. And the two of them, they try to get sobered up, but they relapse, and it's this sort of vicious cycle. And that's what the film is really exploring, is that cycle. So yeah, let's talk Lee Remick. I know that she's the least well known of this group, but do you have any overall thoughts on Lee Remick and her performance here, going toe to toe with Jack Lemmon?
I mean, overall, I would say I like Lee Remick. I do think she is so good in Anatomy of a Murder. I really think she should have been nominated for that. I love that performance, and I grew up with The Omen. That's probably
yes.
the big go-to for me with her, because I watched that movie a ton when I was a kid. So I do like her generally, and I even like her in this movie. I think my big hang-up, though, is that it's something that I have oftentimes with movies that are about addiction, and specifically I find about movies about alcoholism, which is that they get very repetitive. Mm-hmm. And I just find that at a certain point we kind of go through the same cycle of, they're drunk and bad things happen, and then there's a moment of trying to get better, but then there's a relapse, and they try to get better and another relapse, and I just feel like that cycle just keeps going over and over again without much nuance, and sometimes that can also get mirrored in the performances. I will say that I think Lee Remick does provide a lot of gravitas to this role, and I do like her quite a bit, but I also think that she is a bit held back by the character itself, feeling like there's not that much nuance here. It really does feel like this movie's more interested in what Jack Lemmon is doing as opposed to her, and I think her character does get a little shortchanged because of that, but I think she's doing the best with what she has, but I will admit it's not the most compelling thing for me to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of experience with Lee Remick. I mean, I've seen those earlier films of hers. I've seen The Omen. I'd seen this before, but I don't have a super strong association with Lee Remick like I do with these other actresses. I think it's because I do kind of associate her as a kind of Eleanor Parker kind of performer, where they're able to really transform into like whatever their characters need from them. They don't have a super strong, like, identifiable quality. I'm sure I could find one if I watch more of her work, but that's not the impression that I necessarily get from what I've seen of her. And I think that's okay. I don't need every actress to be this huge force of personality or anything. And if anything, I do actually think it helps in a film like this with the character of Kirsten sort of being presented in the beginning as this normal, everyday working woman in the city. She doesn't have a lot of apparent problems, at least, and she blends in quite well, even though she's obviously quite striking, I would say. You see why Jack Lemmon's character would be interested in her. There is this sort of easy, kind of winning charm to her. She's independent-minded. She's this working woman, but she's also charmed by him. They have the classic sort of bickering repartee at the beginning, and there's this setup they have of her being addicted to chocolate, which is obviously a setup for what's to come, showing that she has this addictive personality. But it's in the beginning, she doesn't really have a lot of obvious like personality tics, and she obviously doesn't have a whole lot to do in the beginning because of that, but it does set up how her gradually descending is so tragic, because she seemed so well adjusted in the beginning, and I think it does speak to the messaging of the film, kind of, to have someone like Lee Remick, this seemingly normal, sober person who could just be anyone, really, becoming a bit of like a victim to this disease, and she makes that transition for me feel seamless, even though I agree, like, at a certain point it does become repetitive. I do think looking at her in the beginning and then looking at her in the end, it is kind of like two different people.
Yeah, I do think that she embodies that journey very well. I do also feel like in the beginning, like you said, not much personality trait. I would also maybe argue not much personality to begin with. I kind of feel like the character itself is pretty blank at the beginning of the film.
Yeah. Yep.
Like to the point where I don't even really buy that she would go on a date with this dude who she literally just slapped in the elevator. And I don't know what he really said to endear her enough to actually want to go on a date with him. So it's like,
yeah,
even the
that isn't
first
really explained.
the first start of this relationship just felt very awkward to me. And I think that also means that in terms of me getting invested in her performance of this character, that also kept me a little distant. As it goes on, though, yeah, the cycle I do find to be a bit repetitive at a certain point, but I do think that you find the instances where she does get the real authenticity of what this person would be going through, and the fact that she started off as somebody who like didn't want to drink at all and is now a worse alcoholic than than her partner. I do find that she tracks that rather well, even if it is a little, I would say, pedestrian at times.
Yes. I do think the foundation of the relationship is not as strong as something like the easy thing I can compare it to is something that was recent at the time, which is The Apartment with Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine, and that relationship feeling much more authentic in the way that they both sort of feel like they're on the same frequency. Like it seems like they both have the same sense of humor. I don't really get that from these two necessarily. For me, the way I sort of interpret the beginning of the relationship is that she just seemed to like that he was paying attention to her, even though he kind of was like insulting her job and everything. I don't know. It's very weirdly established. But yeah, obviously the bulk of her showy material comes as the film goes along. For me, the moment that really made me perk up a little more and really pay attention to the performance is after like they have this fight where he comes home drunk, and after she's spent all day caring for their baby, and he's just being belligerent, and saying she's going to lose her figure and all these horrible things, even though she's seeing right in front of her how alcohol is just ruining his life. She plays that sense of disappointment really well, but that doesn't really prevent her, sadly, from, succumbing to the same thing. And I think that for me is the through line that is the most compelling for me with the film in general, is her own perception of what's happening to her. And that like she recognizes that he has a problem and he should probably get help. But then when she starts to drink more and more, and she is reaching this point where she almost killed herself and her baby because she accidentally burned down the apartment, or she went on a bender and she can barely even speak coherently, she still can't vocalize that she has a problem. She can't say that she's an alcoholic. She doesn't even want to get in front of other people to talk about it because she's embarrassed by it. She just feels like she can control everything. Like she has her faculties, and I think that part of it is the most nuanced element of the film for me in this film, that can feel a little bit, moralizing and very like beating you over the head with its message. I think that felt the most true to life aspect for me.
Completely agree. I was also going to mention that very same scene when he comes back drunk and she's just taking care of the baby and succumbs to taking a drink with him, because in that moment she has also given up drinking because she's nursing the child, so she already understands like how damaging alcohol can be and is willing to give it up. But she sees how much her husband is just suffering, and it's like, well, the only way to help him is basically to just get down on the same level with him. And she has complete understanding of how devastating that is, of how harmful that actually is, but she does it anyway because she loves him, and she feels like that's the only way that she can actually comfort him in any significant way. And realizing that for that character, I think, is definitely the highlight of her performance. And it's very quiet. She doesn't even say much when she goes for that drink, but you understand everything that she's about to go through. And I do think that is definitely one of the highlights of her performance in this film.
Yeah, the whole thing of her day drinking at home by herself, she's looser, she's sloppy. Like I said, the whole thing of almost burning down their apartment and killing them almost due to her drinking, which we only see the aftermath of that, unfortunately. But that whole sequence is really fascinating, where he decides that it's time that they have to sober up, and they go off to work for her father, and things are going okay for a while until they just end up succumbing to having a drink, which leads to this bender. And the both of them are so just wasted beyond belief that it's almost disturbing, because it's like, even though they're having a great time, they're like bouncing on the bed and laughing, I do think they both are fully committing to the physicality of it, of how sort of impaired you are, and when you're drunk, and sort of lacking that better judgment and the sort of clumsiness of it all. We like to talk about drunk acting sometimes and how convincing it is. I do think that both of them do capture it in a pretty honest way.
I would say for the most part.
Yeah.
You know, there's, I think the detox sequences with Jack Lemmon, I think your mileage will vary on how much,
Sure.
you're invested in like those sequences. But I think for her, you definitely get the sense that this is somebody who is absolutely an alcoholic and has no control over what she's doing, but is so insecure about that lack of control that she doesn't really tackle on this illness either. And I do like how she's able to navigate that. I do wish that the character was itself a little bit stronger in terms of that presentation, but she does, I think, enough what she can with the material that she's given.
I definitely agree with that. For me, even when you look at like what we talked about with Geraldine Page and Sweet Bird of Youth, like this feels like the least developed character on the whole of everything we're talking about today. But it is to her credit that she can work with what she has to give you that real and honest sense. Like when I see what she's doing here, I can see people in my own life who have gone through, not, it doesn't even have to be, alcoholism. It can be just mental illness, or just anything that they're having to confront, that other people have to sort of tell them about the problem. The sort of quickness of her dismissing the whole idea of her being an alcoholic, I find to be just very real and honest. The scene where she's run away on her own and like is shacked up in this hotel room and is completely gone, even more so than we've seen before, I think is really very shocking and visceral, and like just how far gone she is. That part of it, I mean, I know, again, it's like very overt what the message is here, but the image of it I find to be very striking.
Oh yeah, I mean that low point for her is, you feel it on a very kind of visceral level with what that character is going through, and I think she sells it particularly well. And even all the way up until the very end of the movie, when she comes back and she has this confession about where her life is and how sort of uncertain she feels at that moment and how vulnerable she is. Like I love that moment as well. I think the problem is just that it all does feel like it's filtered through the perspective of her husband, and I think her own personal sense of agency does feel lost throughout the storytelling. But I do like what Remick is bringing to the screen. She's always compelling, but I do think she is held back by that character lacking a little bit more of a more active through line within the narrative for me.
Yeah, but I do think, like we're saying, she does as much as she probably can given the material, and I would hope that with a film like this, and with how visceral it is by the end, yes, it does have those heavy-handed moments and it can be repetitive, but I would hope that there would be some change in how society really sort of talked about alcoholism and getting help and getting sober. I think, again, with her character and his, but for her especially, for me, it is interesting to see this seemingly everyday person becoming susceptible to this so quickly, and how much it can spiral out of control. So maybe it did have a positive effect on audiences. I mean, there's obviously been so many stories that tackle this, but I do feel like this is one that people go to as an obvious, almost inspiration. So I can hope that this performance maybe did inspire some change, maybe, with how people sort of considered alcoholism. I know that's not really having to do with the performance, but just generally, societally speaking, I would say that this is a good movie.
Oh yeah, I mean, and especially for the time, probably wasn't a ton of representation like that. And for 62, it feels very grounded and not, Hollywoodized at all. For the time, it feels like it's very much like kind of a gritty movie to experience. And I do think that her performance mirrors that a lot, and it's a good performance. I think another example, as with a lot of the performances in this lineup, it's better than the movie that it's being, that it is surrounded by. And I think, unfortunately, that is kind of an anchor that holds the impact back a bit. But I do like what she's doing. I do like her portrayal of this character going through this journey of somebody who didn't even want to touch alcohol to is now just completely lost to it and has no real sense of ever getting better from it, and how sad and tragic that is. But I do just wish that the actual like foundations of that character were stronger, because then I would have a much stronger impact to that entire process, I feel like.
Yeah, it's hard for me to really fault her for it, but the other films do have stronger characterization, and unfortunately that does kind of prevent me from, in a situation like this, feeling like she is doing the best necessarily.
Yeah, she's good. I like her in the movie, but yeah, I think that she is not really given enough opportunities to like really knock it out of the park, just because of the way of that character is constructed.
Yeah, but glad she got this nomination. She can call herself Academy Award nominee Lee Remick.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes. Let's get to our big winner, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right. Anne Bancroft for The Miracle Worker. First time nominee, first time winner. Anne Bancroft is an actress who will come up multiple times on this show, this being her first of 5 Best Actress nominations. And Anne Bancroft is another one who studied the method at the Actors Studio. Her first role was in Don't Bother to Knock in 1952, and she was in a number of films that didn't really go anywhere for her career. So she went to the stage, where she actually won 2 Tony Awards. One was for Two for the Seesaw, and then the other for The Miracle Worker, which she did originate on Broadway with Patty Duke. And this is them reuniting for this film adaptation with Arthur Penn directing. Apparently the studio wanted Elizabeth Taylor for this part.
God.
Can't imagine what that would look like. And they were also concerned that Patty Duke was too old to play Helen Keller. But Arthur Penn just insisted, and they got to do it themselves with a smaller budget than they would have gotten if they'd done Elizabeth Taylor. But I think they made the right call here. But the film, it tells the story of Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf and mostly helpless due to her family not knowing how to teach her or know what to do with her. So they hire this teacher, Annie Sullivan, played by Anne Bancroft, who went to school for the blind and has partial vision, so she wears sunglasses, and she slowly but surely tries to teach Helen how to communicate using sign language and get her to connect with the idea that words have meaning, even as Helen is prone to tantrums and these violent outbursts, which makes it very difficult for Annie. So let's talk Anne Bancroft. Any thoughts on Anne Bancroft as an actress and her Oscar-winning performance?
Well, generally speaking, I do really like Anne Bancroft. I think that she was a really great actress, and I also love her in this movie. I love this movie just in general. I just think that it's so incredibly well done. And I mean, it's sort of hard for me to not also think about Patty Duke in this movie, because it just feels like they are in such tandem with this film. But for Bancroft particularly, I just am so amazed in these like very quiet moments that she brings to this movie, where you understand her personal history and why she's so committed to this job and how those vulnerabilities will showcase, but you get her strength both emotionally and physically. I mean, there are the physical sequences in this movie are just jaw-dropping to me. Like, I could just drop everything and watch some of those scenes, and I think that it's just a towering performance, honestly. Like, it doesn't have the grandiose emotional kind of presentations like we see with some of the other performances in this category, but I still think you find it internalized so much throughout many scenes in this film, and I think it's a really fantastic performance.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, with Anne Bancroft, it's funny because I almost feel like I take her for granted. Because,
Mm-hmm.
like, when I think about my favorite actresses and everything, she doesn't always come up. But when I do just look at her performances in so many films, I'm like, she's great in that. She's incredible in that. She just has so much range. She's hilarious in certain roles. And it's like, oh, maybe she is like one of the best there ever was. Like, I feel like she doesn't have that super definable thing that like Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn would have. She's just really, really good at her job and she always understands the assignment, you know?
Yep.
And I think sometimes when you have these stage to screen adaptations where you've played the character before on the stage and now you're trying to adapt the performance for film, it can feel still theatrical or like you're just still shouting to the rafters when the camera's like right there in your face, or even that you've aged out of it, like Ben Platt and Dear Evan Hansen. But Anne Bancroft here like really does, I think, adapt her performance for the screen and is using the camera to her advantage, especially in those close-ups that we can't really get on stage. And we like are seeing her processing exactly what she needs to do to help Helen, and we see how it's just like the toil of everything is affecting her physically. And we also see sometimes her reliving her own trauma of being taught as a child, and all of that while trying to keep her composure and sort of teach this very stubborn girl while also having her own kind of stubborn attitude too. There's just so much that she has to juggle, plus making enough of an impression that she fits the role of the sort of assertive, stubborn teacher and doesn't seem weak, but you can still see like her vulnerability cracking through. Like, it's kind of amazing what she does here. And there's no doubt in my mind that her previous experience on the stage and working with Patty Duke really made it so that she really became this character. And probably the hard part for her was just having to still make the performance work for the screen.
And it's amazing that she was able to do that. Like you mentioning how you really have to like recalibrate this performance to work on the screen instead of on the stage, and the fact that they were able to find those very small subtle moments within this performance and still make it work so well, like it's amazing to witness. And this is another character that there's a lot on her plate. Like it's a very dense backstory that she has with a lot of conflicting emotions happening, but she is able to sell it in every single scene. And most of the time she's not yelling. Like, she does yell, she
Yeah.
does have those big moments, but for a lot of this movie, she feels very calm and in control. And it makes the moments when she does have to kind of go bigger and feel like she is losing control feel all that more powerful, because you understand this is somebody who knows what she needs to do and is always feeling like she has to assemble those pieces to get there, but is, sometimes it's got to be behind and needs to catch up and figure out how to then work within this new situation. And every moment, Anne Bancroft sells that just so beautifully.
Yeah. And on top of everything else, she's doing an Irish accent. Like, there's just so
Incredible.
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
The long fight sequence in the dining room, I think, is like a masterclass just in terms of physical acting. Because, Helen has just been taught to just like eat off the table from other people's food whenever she feels like it. And, Annie is obviously outraged by this and commands everyone else to get out as to sort of teach her the table manners. And there's no dialogue. It's all this nonverbal communication and purely physical acting. And I think here is when you definitely see how in sync they are just from doing it on the stage for as many times as they did, because the choreography is so controlled but also chaotic at the same time. It doesn't feel overly rehearsed, and you can see just the physical strain from both of them in a way that is very convincing. This is a scene that is, I think, very tough to watch, but it's such a knockout scene from both of them. And it did not surprise me to learn that like they had to wear padding during this scene to not physically get hurt.
Oh yeah, this is one of my like favorite scenes ever in film. Like this, the physicality, as you said, is just so impressive, and the fact that there's no dialogue happening either. Like you have to understand every bit of motivation that is happening with these characters through their actions alone. And I mean, they're both excellent in it for sure. Like I think both of them are doing great work in that moment. But the fact that also Anne Bancroft has to be the character who can see and hear, but is also battling with this other character who doesn't have that, but is also putting up a fight at the same time. But there's also like this conflicting emotion of kind of wanting to hate this child, but you also are there to help her at the same time. And it's this very tough process. And it's just, and to communicate all of that without any words, just all through this physicality, it's like, it's amazing to witness that.
It really is. It blows me away every time I watch it. And I mean, like, on the opposite end, I think her subtle moments are great. Like, another great scene is after they've gone off to this cottage to help Helen just sort of on her own in this isolated area. You know, it's come time for her parents to pick her back up. And Annie is just thinking that there's a possibility that Helen is just going to regress after Annie is gone. And you're also seeing her processing like how she formed this connection with Helen, but that it's not like she's her daughter. She doesn't love her. There's only so much she can do. And I think she communicates all of those kind of conflicting feelings of having to more or less give up and sort of hand her over, even knowing that she hasn't quite broken through to her. And then having that scene coming after what she said at the cottage to that man of how like the original sin for her was the idea of giving up. I think you really are feeling the sort of stubborn attitude and that sort of like, I still feel like I haven't gotten where I needed to be for this girl, and now I have to give her up and it's eating me up inside. I think she communicates all of that really well.
And you understand also how her helping Helen is also helping herself. That's another reason why she's so attached to this objective, because she has her own kind of emotional investment within it. And it's complicated, you know? And I find that she is able to showcase that within the character so wonderfully. And you get that sense of these conflicting motivations, but that still want to serve the same purpose, but for different kind of methods and for different backstories around them. Like I just find that to be so fascinating. And every moment that Anne Bancroft is in this movie, I think is a true masterclass in performance. It's such a great role.
It really is. It's such a showcase, and is also another situation, I think, where if it's not the right actor, then it is not as effective, you know? So I like the idea of Elizabeth Taylor playing this part even at this time when she's close to doing like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Like I still feel like it doesn't really work.
No, and you know, all due respect to Miss Taylor, you know, we love her, but this would not have been a good role for her. Like just the sensibilities would not have matched.
No. And I think the ending of the film, I think, is very well earned, where she is finally able to break through and get Helen to understand that the words and the concepts that she's been teaching her do have real meaning. And just the sense of relief that she has that is so visible to the audience there is really profound, honestly, and I think very cathartic for the audience too, after all of this struggle that she's gone through. And this isn't even a long movie, you know. I think this is the shortest movie that we're talking about of these 5, but it still feels like she's gone through so much during this time, and yet you feel that sense of relief from her, and it just leaves the audience in this really nice cathartic place, and it doesn't sort of belabor the point necessarily. So I
Yeah.
love the ending.
It's so earned, as you said, because you
Mm-hmm.
really do feel that journey that both of them have been on, and you've been rooting for them so hard. And it's like we get these close moments, we get progress, but not enough. And when we finally get to the end and we get this resolution that, as we said, just feels like it has been so earned at this
Mm-hmm.
moment, and there's just such elation in the emotions too that, and like, yeah, the music is doing a lot of that for sure, but
Sure.
you also really do feel it in the performance, and like when she's going through, when she figures out that this is supposed to be water, and she's going through all the other terms too, and
Mm-hmm.
you really feel the energy and the sense of accomplishment and relief and gratitude at that moment. And you do see it in her performance as well, even though the filmmaking, I think, is tipping us very much in the direction to feel that way. I do also think you see it in her performance too.
Yeah, I agree. It's all working together, I would say, to give you that huge emotional wallop of an ending. So I think now we can talk about the Oscar race and why we think Anne Bancroft was our big winner here. Just to sort of set the table, there was no New York Film Critics Award this year because there was a strike. So the indication I got was that it was an open field because that's one of the only precursors there was at that time. And it turns out even Katharine Hepburn campaigned for herself.
Mm.
There was a columnist, Sheila Graham, who said Hepburn, almost as much of a recluse as Garbo, is actually almost as accessible as Zsa Zsa Gabor. She'd love to win, which is
Wow.
fascinating.
Never thought I'd
Yeah,
hear those two names in the same sentence.
I know, right? Yeah. As far as the other like precursors, though, Lee Remick was nominated at BAFTA and the Golden Globes. Actually, all 5 of them were nominated together at the Golden Globes. And Katharine Hepburn won at the Cannes Film Festival. Geraldine Page won the Golden Globe, nominated at BAFTA. And Anne Bancroft won at BAFTA, and she won the National Board of Review Award. So everyone was really in the running, I think, which is what made this such a competitive year. All of them really delivering these, really baity, powerful performances that maybe could have won in a weaker year. But I think we should talk about the Joan Crawford of it all, right?
Yeah, it's sort of
'Cause
impossible not to.
yes. So Joan Crawford, not nominated, offered to accept for any Best Actress nominee that couldn't attend, which was most of them. And she was dressed to the nines in this very elegant silver gown, diamonds. She was basically like, I'm going to be the star of the evening, much to the chagrin of Bette Davis, who was in attendance and who I read actually did want to win and become the first actress to win 3 Oscars.
Yep, she
And
really wanted it.
oh, yeah. And she was supported by her friend, Olivia de Havilland, who was also in the press advocating for her. There was a lot going on there. So it really felt like it was more or less anyone's award to win. I would be curious, Josh, if you were in 1962 forecasting the race, what you would have placed your bets on. But
yeah, would have been interesting because we also, like, none of these performances are in Best Picture nominees, right?
right, which
Yeah.
makes it tricky, right? So let's talk about it. Why do we think Anne Bancroft managed to rise above all of this heavyweight talent and win this Oscar?
Well, I think if you look at the field, at least in terms of the movies themselves, like I do think you could get a sense that The Miracle Worker probably was the one people liked the most. Like, even though none of these are nominated for Best Picture, I believe Miracle Worker did at least have a director and screenplay nomination. So
Yes.
it felt like it was pretty close to that realm anyway. And it does feel like, the classy stage adaptation. It had a lot of acclaim and other nominations in these very important categories. And it feels like that probably is something that gave Anne Bancroft the edge. And as I've talked about before, when there's a divided race, you kind of look for those signs of what movie itself is stronger. And certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that that was The Miracle Worker.
Definitely. I think that is a huge part of it. I'm still surprised looking back on it that it wasn't nominated for Best Picture.
Yeah, I've honestly had always assumed it was a Best Picture nominee.
Like, I truly don't understand what Mutiny on the Bounty is doing there, first of all.
Truly.
Because that is a horrific remake. And it's just a weird Best Picture lineup to begin with, because like 3 of them don't have any acting nominations or directing nominations. It's just very strange.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's worth noting that I feel like Anne Bancroft is playing the most quote unquote likable character of the bunch.
Yeah.
You could say. I think when
and a real
compare,
person too, yeah.
And a real person, which they do traditionally really love. And it's such a sympathetic story that they're telling that it's possible that there's just too much darkness going on with the rest of the nominees. And here you have this really hopeful story, plus Anne Bancroft kind of having this breakout moment that people felt like, oh, this is really exciting and new and different from what the others are giving. And that's kind of how she was able to stand out. You know, I also just think her and Patty Duke really just elevate each other, which is why they both end up winning. Would be curious to see if Patty Duke was here in the Best Actress race, which she probably should be, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree.
What would have happened? Yeah.
Yeah, I also do wonder if the whole controversy with Baby Jane and the whole feud that was happening in the press probably was a turnoff to some other people too, to be like, yeah, this is a great performance from Bette Davis, but like, oh, there's so much baggage with awarding drama. Her too. Yeah, yes. And it's like, do we really want to indulge in that right now? Like, I don't know.
And also, we've already taken care of her twice in the past, you know? Yeah, I think that is a very good point. But with Anne Bancroft not being there, of course, Joan Crawford did triumphantly walk to the stage and accept that Oscar.
Yes, as if she had won herself.
Yes, as Bette Davis seethed backstage, as legend has it, at least.
I mean, that's another thing that gets thrown into the pile of what we think we know of this story about this movie, and it's one of the reasons why the movie has endured. I mean, it's a good movie and a good performance too, but absolutely the gossip around it is undeniable that has it's a major element of what has fueled so much interest in this film throughout the years.
Yes, exactly. But I did stumble upon this quote from Bette Davis that I did want to read here, which was from years later, talking about this night, and she said, "I was positive I would get it. So was everybody in town. I almost dropped dead when I didn't win. I wanted to be the first actress to win 3 times, but now it's been done, so I may as well give up." And of course, the fact that Miss Crawford got permission to accept for any of the other nominees was hysterical. I was nominated, but she was receiving the acclaim. It would have meant $1 million more to our film if I had won. Joan was thrilled that I hadn't. So, you know, feeding into the hype of the feud and everything, it still feels like it's a feud that they kind of just amplified for hype more so than felt necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it was a way to sell tickets to the movie for sure. Like, I'm sure that's one of the reasons why people were so fascinated by it, because like, oh, these 2 big time Hollywood actresses like going at each other on set, and they're antagonistic in the movie. Will we see it in the actual performance? You know, and it's like, I'm sure there was, you know, some animosity, but like there always is on a movie set. And I am very convinced that, was there some bickering back and forth? For sure. Was it to the extent that they made it out to be in the press? Probably not. It was an exaggeration, but it has helped with the movie's legacy for sure. Like, that's undeniable, but I'm sure it was not quite as bad as people made it out to be.
Agreed. Yes. So a very fun clip. It is available to watch on YouTube if you haven't already. Just the sheer joy of Joan Crawford is I can never get enough of watching that.
I mean, arguably campier than anything in the actual movie.
Truly. Just grinning from ear to ear. She looks incredible. Like, it's a moment, for sure. All right, let's get to some Twitter questions, shall we?
Let's.
Both Fritz and Matt Stillman ask us if this is an all-time great lineup in this category.
Well, I sort of said at the beginning that I did find it to be rather top heavy. And I do think it's more so because the movies themselves are not equally as great as some of these performances. I think all the performances are good. I just wish that the movies themselves were better, and that would push it more into an all-time great Best Actress lineup for me. But as it is, I like all the performances. They're just not all attached to good movies.
Yeah, that makes sense. For me, it's top two or three of what I've covered so far. So I'll say that. I don't know if
Yeah.
I would say number one right now. When I get to the very end of this show, I will make a decision on what was the very best, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, I do think this is, yeah, pound for pound, one of the best lineups in the sense that for me, there's not a weak link in the bunch. There almost always is for me. So this one is like, yeah, my number five could easily just be my winner in another year. That's kind of how I feel. So,
Yeah, I can agree
yeah.
with that.
Yeah. Lila said, if they made a remake of The Miracle Worker today, who do you think would be perfect for the lead roles? First of all, I don't think there should be a remake, but what do you think, Josh?
Oh man, I feel like there's already been like endless remakes of this
There's
too.
been a few. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Do you have
I
an
did.
idea?
I came up with a few just because I knew this question was coming. For some reason, I don't know where this came from, but just thinking about age and sort of status and the fact that she's already been nominated recently, I came up with Vanessa Kirby.
Huh, interesting.
Yes. And I just feel like she has a surprising kind of commanding presence, and she is still young enough where the character, by the way, is only supposed to be 20 years old.
I mean,
Which
that is also true. Yeah.
I don't think Anne
They did
Bancroft
mention that
really
it's like, wait,
looks.
how old is she supposed to be? Because she
Yeah.
mentioned like her brother dying like 10 years ago and he was like
Yeah.
12. It's like, wait,
Right.
how old is she?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think she is a younger actress who could carry off a bit of screen presence. I don't know. It's just something random I thought of. I'm not fully committed to the idea, but I think she could pull it off. I love Vanessa Kirby. So for child actors, I don't know. It's always tough. I'm sure someone like McKenna Grace would be contacted for this. I think she'd be great. I don't know. Brooklyn Prince. It's hard to say. Probably just an unknown.
Yeah, I think that probably would be better.
Yeah, that's it. I don't know if you've come up with anyone else for the Annie character.
Uh, no, I mean, I am sort of just with you that, yeah, we kind of don't need
Yeah.
another one. I mean, there's so many good actresses that could play that role, but at the same time, like Anne Bancroft just seems so definitive. Like I
Yeah.
don't need anybody else.
Agreed. Agreed. The trouble with me is finding like a younger actress who gives that kind of commanding presence that you need for this. And I feel like I
Yeah.
can't really think of a lot of younger actresses these days who have that. So
Yeah, I think that's the trouble.
Andrew Carden said, let's say Patty Duke went lead instead. Does she make the cut here? And would that have impacted Bancroft's chances of winning?
Ooh. I'm tempted to say she makes the cut, but it's hard to say.
I don't know if she does, honestly. I think there was
No.
such a stigma against child actors in lead.
I mean, like I could go either way because
Yeah.
definitely there is that stigma against child actresses in the leading categories, and but at the same time, it just seems like the movie was really well liked and
It was.
respected. That maybe she could have overcome that.
Yeah. If she was there, I don't know if it would have made a difference because they're just doing such different things that I don't know if they would be like vote split necessarily.
Yeah, although it's another one that's hard to say because yeah, they are doing different things, but she's got the role where she's playing Helen Keller, so she can't speak.
That's
The
true.
character is blind. There's a ton more physicality to deal with. Like I could imagine that being a very compelling argument to vote for as well.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Dustin Van said, does Baby Jane work or have the same Oscars pedigree without the pairing of Davis and Crawford? What other leading ladies of the era do you see in their respective roles, and do either of them receive Oscar noms?
Oh yeah, that's a good question because I do think so much of this movie is about the feud between them, and I think that's the reason why people had so much interest in it because like as a movie it's very good and I do like it, but so much of it is also held up by those two actresses in these roles, like even outside of the gossip, just their personas themselves are
Right.
what really draws you into this movie. So you take that element away, I don't know if the movie has that much power anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Probably not. But I do have, I think, a good answer for if it wasn't them, who would be interesting to see in terms of contemporaries of theirs. Let's bring in real life sisters Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine.
Well, I can't do any better than that.
Who famously did not get along.
Yep.
So, just saying.
There's your answer. Yep, that's
Yep.
it.
Okay. Would have been interested to see that version, let me tell you.
I mean, I think that's the only other version of the movie that could have possibly existed.
Yes. And I think Olivia plays Jane and Joan plays Blanche.
I mean, obviously, yes.
Yeah. Moving on, Sue Ellen Rossi said, as Baby Jane sort of ushered in the trend of grand guignol movies, are there any actresses from the subsequent films that would have deserved a nomination? So the kind of hagsploitation, as they call it. I mean, Olivia de Havilland in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, I think, is very good.
She is good. I don't like that movie very much, but
no, I don't either. But
she's very good in it. On that same train, the movie that Joan Crawford did instead of that, was it Straight Jacket?
Yes,
I think was the name of it. I really love that movie actually, and I think she's actually very good in it.
Trog.
Joan
Crawford's final film.
Oh man, I do miss that era of Oscar winners in these terrible horror movies.
Yes, that could be its own series of its own.
Yes, it's so great.
Christoph said, how do you think Bette Davis would have reacted if, on the night, someone would have told her that this was her last ever nomination, whereas Hepburn would have 3 more nominations and wins ahead?
I think she would have said, "You're lying."
You're lying.
She would never have believed it.
I mean, I think on some level she did have some self-awareness and probably would recognize how fortunate she was to even get another nomination at this point in her career. I'm sure she was surprised to eventually see Katharine win 3 more times. So, yeah, she would probably be a little thrown off by that, especially her wanting to win 3 times,
Yeah. I think also a third time for a very kind of unusual movie to win an Oscar. I mean, I do love it and I love the performance, but in the grand scheme of things, it's, a genre movie at the end of the day. So it's very weird. If it had been an Oscar winning performance, it would have been quite atypical.
Right. Katori said, if Davis wins, does it better her chances for Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966? So she was in the mix for that, just to set the table for where that's coming from. I don't know. I mean, I imagine it would have helped. It wouldn't have hurt if she had won an Oscar recently. I know she was envisioned for the role by Jack Warner, so...
Yeah, but I mean, Taylor also had an Oscar at that point too, so...
Yes, that's true.
Yes, I don't know. I think that's a little bit more up in the air. Like you said, wouldn't have hurt to put her more in the running, but just because she had another Oscar doesn't mean that Elizabeth Taylor would have been completely disqualified either.
Right, because she was like in her own stratosphere of stardom by that point.
Exactly.
Kareem Balak said, why do you think Bette Davis got nominated over Joan Crawford? I think this is rather simple. She just has the better part.
Yeah, the better part, the more interesting character to play. Yeah. There's more layers there. I think that is the main reason why.
Cinema Sex Kitten said, rank all of Bette Davis's nominations, but only on the metric of being a bad bitch.
Well, I will default to you because I haven't seen all of her nominated performances, so I will default to you with this one.
Yes. Okay. Well, I did do a ranking ahead of time. Here's what I've got. My number 1, The Little Foxes. Iconic. I love that performance. And she is ruthless in that film, and I live for it. Number 2 for me is Jezebel. 3, I would say All About Eve. The ending is slightly less bad bitch than I would hope, but generally speaking, a very bad bitch. Number 4, The Letter. Number 5, I'll do Baby Jane. Number 6, even though this isn't a nomination, I did Of Human Bondage. She was a write-in vote.
Yeah.
Number 7, Dangerous. It's like the same thing, but worse. Number 8, The Star. A little too pathetic to be Bad Bitch, but still fine. Number 9, Now Voyager. Playing a sympathetic person. I don't know if I would consider that Bad Bitch, but good for her transformation. Number 10, Dark Victory. Not really bad in that. Number 11, I have Mr. Skeffington. I just find the whole film to be garbage. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
All right, that sounds appropriate.
Good. Moving on. Gordon said, if you could only give a nomination to one other cast member from Long Day's Journey into Night, which one would you pick? We didn't really talk about the other performances there, so I'm curious what you would pick.
Yeah, I go back and forth because I do like everybody else. They're just not playing as interesting characters as Hepburn is. Honestly, I did really like Dean Stockwell in it. I thought that he had at least the dynamic with him and Hepburn I thought was interesting. So maybe I would say him. They're all sort of equally kind of okay in my opinion.
Yeah, I also would say Dean Stockwell here. I think he felt like he came the most alive to me.
Yeah, because I think he's also a character that has one of the more interesting backstories of the other men in the role in this movie, because the other ones, I kind of got them like pretty instantly what their arcs were, and they weren't all that interesting. And there was at least a little bit more going on with him.
Yes, agreed. And he's not bad to look at.
That is true. Yes.
Christoph said this is the fourth and last time Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn went head to head after 1935, 1940, and 1942. What is your favorite of those 4 matchups? For me, it's definitely this one, and it's not even close.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Just the level of performance from these characters, particularly that they're embodying, I think is just like, it's so endearing and captivating. It's hard to match.
Yes. Sue Ellen Rossi said, other than her own role in Sweet Bird of Youth, which of the other performances do you think Geraldine Page would have excelled in? My answer would be all of them. That's what Sue Ellen Rossi says. And I think I'd actually agree. Like, she could probably do all of these roles at different parts of her career. I think probably Long Day's Journey would probably be best, considering just her stage experience.
Yeah, I would say so with the stage experience. I do think she could also make Days of Wine and Roses once again feel a little bit more alive too, because a similar addiction habit, kind of exploration. And I think much like with Sweet Bird of Youth, that not a very well written character, but she makes it come alive based on her own natural screen presence. I imagine she would have done the exact same thing with that role.
Yeah, I like that. JPS said, what were the potential domino effects of either a Hepburn or Page win this year? Someone else winning in 67 or 85. Barbara wins outright in 68. Those are the suggestions he's saying. I think there's probably a lot of changes, honestly. I think if Katharine Hepburn wins, then maybe Anne Bancroft wins in 67.
Probably.
Yeah.
For The Graduate.
The Graduate, yeah. But if Page wins, I think it's probably still Hepburn in 67. Yeah. And then in 68, if Hepburn wins, she's won twice already recently, then probably Barbra Streisand just wins on her own without the tie. Might be my guess.
I would think so, but who knows?
But it is The Lion in Winter, so it's hard to ignore that.
Yeah, it was a huge movie. I mean, they were both huge movies, but The Lion in Winter is kind of monumental that year.
Yeah. If Geraldine Page wins here, I think we probably still get the tie eventually. I don't know if Anne Bancroft ever wins in that case. I don't know, which would be a shame. But then Geraldine Page, if she wins here, then Whoopi Goldberg probably wins in 85. Yeah.
Yeah, and would probably then be the only win for that movie.
Yep. Just like Olivia Colman.
Yep.
Looping it back around. For a few more miscellaneous questions here, Jim said, was Crawford in the 6th spot or someone else? I don't know. I mean, I think there was a lot of competition this year. I think Shelley Winters in Lolita was strong here.
Mm-hmm.
I think Rosalind Russell in Gypsy was very baity. So I don't know. I don't know if she was sixth.
Yeah, I don't think she was. I kind of feel like it was mostly about Bette Davis, and I think that there was fascination with what Crawford was doing, but I have a feeling like she may not have been that close to a nomination.
Yeah. Joey Gentili said, let's say it looks like Crawford, Davis, Duke, Bancroft, and Mary Badham gets pushed lead. Does she make it in? And if not, who's the fifth? That would be a wild lineup. I doubt that we get two child performers in Best Actress, so I don't think Mary Badham would make it in if Patty Duke is already in.
Yeah.
I think if not her, then I don't know. I guess Geraldine Page.
Yeah, I'll go with that. I definitely think that Patty Duke would be the stronger contender for sure.
For sure. Fritz said, what would have happened if Mary Badham had been promoted in lead? She wouldn't have been nominated.
Yeah. There you go.
That's what happened. Yeah. So good for her for at least getting nominated somewhere, even if she didn't belong in supporting actress either.
Yeah.
Cinema Sex Kitten said 1962 saw the debut of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. From this list, who would you cast in the roles of Martha and Honey?
Ooh.
I don't know if this is just too obvious, but the ones that are, flashing to me right now is just Bette Davis and Lee Remick, right?
Yeah, that seems like the very obvious way to go with it.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about Geraldine Page excelling in like anything really, so I could maybe see that too. But I think, Bette Davis and Lee Remick just feels so obvious.
Yeah, I can't see anyone else playing Honey, at least, than Lee Remick.
Yeah.
From this group, at least. I'm just envisioning Anne Bancroft with her husband, Mel Brooks, in a version of Virginia Woolf.
Oh, that would have been fun to see.
That would have been high comedy. Would love to see it. Well, speaking of casting, Greg Adams has a very complex one here. Recast these 6 roles, he's including Joan Crawford here, using the 7 women with the most Best Actress nominations that you haven't covered yet, which is Meryl Streep, Jane Fonda, Sissy Spacek, Ellen Burstyn, Judi Dench, Jessica Lange, and Susan Sarandon. And he also noted you can't pull a Ryan Murphy. So I guess that means I can't do Jessica Lange and Susan Sarandon for Baby Jane. That's fine.
Yeah, that seems appropriate. There's a lot of names on that list.
Yes. I spent a lot of time trying to configure the right combination here. I don't know if this is perfect, but just let me know what you think of this.
Okay.
For Long Day's Journey into Night, I went with Meryl Streep.
All right, that sounds appropriate.
Right? She could do that.
Yeah.
Days of Wine and Roses, I have Sissy Spacek.
Okay. I think I can see it. I can, yeah.
I don't know. I'm just working with what I got here.
Yeah.
For Sweet Bird of Youth, I said it already, Jessica Lange.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. For The Miracle Worker, Susan Sarandon.
Oh, I can see that.
Absolutely. And then, I don't know how I got here, but just, I was trying to find a good combination for whatever happened to Baby Jane, and I landed on Judi Dench and Ellen Burstyn. I have no idea what I'm doing here. It's just, that's how it landed.
I would see that movie. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will have Judi Dench as Jane in that case.
Oh, yes.
I want to see her go full just Notes on a Scandal camp with that role.
We need that Judy back. Yes.
Yes, please. And I don't know if Ellen Burstyn is like the best fit for Blanche there, but that's what I was left with. And if not her, then Jane Fonda, who I did not really find a great role for, unfortunately. But what do you think? Do you think she could have fit
Jane
into
Fonda
one of these?
could do Blanche. I think she could do that.
Yeah.
We can go with it. It's the fantasy anyway.
We'll go with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. A few others here. Sammy Flowers said Rosalind Russell and Natalie Wood both missed out on nominations for Gypsy, even though Wood had just been nominated the year before and Russell was an Academy favorite. Is this due to a winding down on love of musicals or a winding down on love of them?
Well, as you mentioned before, is just a very competitive Best Actress race too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other performances here were just stronger dramatically. And I don't really think that voters were necessarily winding down on musicals. Like, we still have Julie Andrews coming, we have Barbara Streisand coming, so.
Yeah.
And the last two here are very much leading us into our final segment. Ayrton O'Brien said, Bette Davis came fourth in this lineup in voting. Change my mind. I guess we'll see. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And then Maury Ritchie said, who do you think came in second place in this category? Well, that is what we are here to discuss. So let's jump right into our final segment. Who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. I'm not sure what you're going to say, Josh. I don't even know what I'm going to say. It could just be live in the moment. Whatever you're feeling right now. Who was number two?
I mean, I do feel like number two was Bette Davis. I mean, she was a titan of the industry. She clearly made it known to people that she wanted it. The movie was a big hit, and it did also, I think, win another Oscar. Like, it won something below the line, but it was still... It got another acting nomination too. Like, it was a very popular movie at the same time and had the press around it as well. And even though, yes, it was negative press or very messy, it was still really well known. And it's still also Bette Davis and still providing great work in this more modern era for her. And I do feel like that would have been a very, very compelling argument for her to win the award. Not enough to overcome Anne Bancroft, but I do feel like she is the runner-up here.
Yes, I agree with you. I think it was Bette Davis, and I think there's a possibility that it could have been Geraldine Page, because, you know, she did win the Golden Globe, not that it mattered as much back then, but she had that, plus she was building up her narrative. I think she was just nominated the year before, so they're clearly liking what they see from her. And it is a very Beatty part as well, even though it's a co-lead / supporting, you could say. I think there's something about kind of the wildness of that performance that seems like something they tend to go for. But I do think, yeah, for all the reasons you stated, Bette Davis just had a lot in her favor. So, yeah, I wonder how close it actually was in the end that Anne Bancroft won. Because it wasn't necessarily like signed, sealed, and delivered for her going into it. So.
Yeah, I imagine that it was close, but I do think that if I were to guess who was in second place, I feel pretty confident that it was Bette Davis.
Yeah. Plus, Olivia de Havilland was campaigning for her, and she is a very powerful person, as we know.
Oh,
She
yes.
had a lot of industry connections. She managed to make an Olivia de Havilland law come into place. So she did have quite a political power at this time. So final question for you, Josh. Who would be your winner? Who would you have voted for from this lineup?
You know, I think I have to agree with the Academy. I think I would vote for Anne Bancroft. And I do love Bette Davis as well and the other performances, but there is just so much power in what Anne Bancroft brings to this role, where when it's quiet, it's effective. When it's big, it's also effective. And it's just so impactful in every single scene of hers. And I also just do really love that movie as well. I think it's just so well written and directed, and I think her performance also plays into a lot of those elements. So, yeah, I would agree with the Academy on this one. I would have voted for Anne Bancroft.
Well, on a different day, I think I would have as well. In this case, right now, what I'm feeling is I would have voted for Bette Davis. I'm not even gonna lie.
I can't argue with that. It's a great performance, especially at the end. Like, if it wasn't for the ending, like the second half of this movie, that's where you really get the subtleties of that performance. And it tempts me to vote for her too. It's very close between those two.
Yes. And another reason why I would say that is because in my own beautiful mind alternate timeline of me giving out these Oscars, I had only given it to her once before for Now Voyager, and so I feel like I owe her this one. Just personally speaking, if it's reality, I still think I would probably be swayed to vote for Bette Davis, and I would have been totally wrapped up in the drama. And I also think Twitter would have been a mess.
Oh my god. If Twitter was around, it would have melted down.
so many stands, so many warring factions going on there.
Jesus, yes.
Yes. And all the Joan Crawford of it all would just be too much for us all to handle.
Yeah, it's good that that Twitter wasn't around, because we would not have survived.
Truly. On that note, thank you so much, Josh, for doing this. I think this was a wonderful discussion and very fitting of this iconic year. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
And of course, you're welcome back anytime in the future. We will maybe discuss offline if you have more modern races you would want to talk about.
I think there might be some,
yes.
So we'll keep an eye out on that.
Yes. Well, tell the fine people where they could find more of you on the internet.
You can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd over at Josh Parham, and you can also find my work at Next Best Picture and over at Awards Watch.
Yes, indeed. And thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show's at Oscar Runner Up. Instagram at And the Runner Up is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/And the Runner Up is. And in 2 weeks, we will be delving into the 1963 Best Actress lineup, where the nominees were Leslie Caron for The L-Shaped Room, Shirley MacLaine in Irma la Douce, Patricia Neal in HUD, Rachel Roberts in This Sporting Life, and Natalie Wood in Love with the Proper Stranger, with the winner being Patricia Neal. That is a very interesting race that we will have fun talking about. So that's what to watch before the next episode. Thanks again, Josh.
Well, thank you.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.